The universe is not falling apart. It may be quietly leaning. For centuries, we have trusted a comforting assumption that the universe is fair, balanced, the same in every direction. No up, no down, no center. Wherever you stand, the cosmos looks statistically identical, as if reality itself agreed to be neutral. But what if that assumption is the most fragile idea we have ever held? Imagine standing in a vast, silent hall, so enormous that its walls disappear into darkness. At first, everything feels level, stable, ordinary. Yet after a while, something subtle begins to register, not a fall, not a shake, just a faint insistence in your muscles, a suggestion that the floor is not perfectly flat. You are not sliding, you are not tipping, but you are never fully at rest. What if the universe feels the same way? Tonight, you are listening to Whispers of the Universe. And before we go any further, if this quiet space has ever helped you slow your thoughts or drift toward rest, take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who might need stillness, and subscribe to keep this place alive. This is not content made to be rushed. It only works if you choose to stay. For a long time, cosmology has been built on a promise called isotropy, the idea that on the largest scales, the universe looks the same in all directions. No preferred axis, no cosmic tilt, no imbalance written into space itself. This assumption is so foundational that nearly every modern model rests upon it like a perfectly leveled table. And yet, the data has never fully agreed. Scattered across our observations are quiet anomalies that refuse to line up neatly. Large-scale structures that drift in similar directions when they should cancel out. Temperature patterns in the cosmic background radiation that seem oddly aligned, as if the universe itself has a faint spine. Regions where time appears to stretch or compress just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be explained away. Individually, each anomaly is easy to dismiss. Measurement noise, statistical flukes, cosmic coincidence. Together, they feel less like accidents and more like symptoms. What if these are not random at all? What if the universe is not broken, but tilted? Not tilted in the way a spinning planet wobbles or a galaxy bends under gravity, but tilted at a deeper level, a geometric imbalance woven into space-time itself, a slow, almost immeasurable lean that began so early, so quietly, that light itself never recorded the moment it happened. If the universe were truly leaning even by the smallest possible margin, everything inside it would behave differently. Time would not flow evenly everywhere. Matter would gather more easily in some regions than others. Complexity, chemistry, even consciousness might favor certain cosmic slopes over others, the way water pools where gravity subtly guides it. And no observer living inside such a universe would ever feel the tilt directly. You would not feel yourself sliding through space. You would simply notice that time feels heavier some days, that change accumulates unevenly. That awareness emerges where conditions seem just slightly off from perfect balance. This is the unsettling part. A perfectly balanced universe would be calm but also sterile. No gradients, no flows, no reason for anything to happen at all. It is imbalance that creates motion, difference that generates structure, a slope, however slight, that allows time to move. So perhaps the question is not whether the universe is fair. Perhaps the question is whether fairness was ever stable. If the universe began in perfect symmetry, it would have had no direction to evolve, no reason to prefer one future over another. But a universe that leans even imperceptibly creates direction without intention, a future without a designer, a flow without a force pushing it. And if that is true, then the anomalies we observe are not mistakes. They are echoes, echoes of a moment before observation, before radiation, before the first light could testify. A moment when the universe did not shatter but slipped, ever so slightly out of balance. We tend to imagine cosmic catastrophes as violent events, explosions, collisions, collapses. But the most powerful changes are often the quietest. A degree too small to measure, a preference too subtle to name. Tilt so slow that everything inside adapts without protest, including us. You have never experienced a universe that was perfectly level. You were born inside the lean. Your sense of time, of effort, of fatigue, of awareness, all of it shaped by a cosmic geometry that was never quite symmetrical. And that raises a dangerous thought. If time itself flows like a thin liquid across a tilted surface, then some regions of the universe are downstream, and some are uphill. So where are we standing right now? Because once you begin to see the universe not as a static container, but as a vast structure quietly leaning through its own dimensions, a new question emerges, one we cannot avoid much longer. If the universe is tilted, what direction is time really flowing? Before the universe leaned, it had to be still. Not silent, because silence requires an ear, but balanced in a way that leaves no trace, no preference, no direction, no reason for anything to move more one way than another. A condition so symmetrical that even change itself would have nowhere to begin. This is the state cosmology quietly assumes when it speaks of the early universe. A newborn reality without bias. No up, no down. No faster here, no slower there. Every direction statistically identical, as if existence had agreed to be fair. But fairness is not the same as stability. Imagine a perfectly smooth sphere resting at the peak of an invisible hill. As long as it is centered with infinite precision, it does not roll, it does not fall, it does not move. Yet this condition is not strong, it is fragile. Any disturbance, no matter how small, breaks the stillness immediately. And once motion begins, it does not reverse itself. The early universe may have existed in a similar state, balanced, but only because nothing had yet disturbed it. At first glance, this sounds comforting. A universe born neutral, a cosmos that began without favor or flaw. But there is a problem hidden inside this idea, one that physics rarely says out loud. Perfect symmetry cannot explain why anything happens. In a universe with absolute balance, there is no reason for matter to clump here instead of there. No reason for time to flow faster in one region than another. No reason for complexity to arise at all. Symmetry does not create structure, it erases it. And yet, structure exists. Galaxies form in filaments instead of evenly. Energy gathers in pockets. Time behaves differently near mass, motion, and scale. Even in the earliest light, we can observe the faint afterglow of the universe's birth. There are irregularities, small, yes, but persistent, patterned, directional. These are not the marks of a universe that remained perfectly balanced. They are the marks of something that slipped. The strange part is not that the universe might have lost its balance. The strange part is how quietly it could have happened. We tend to imagine beginnings as violent, a bang, a rupture, a flash so bright it defines time itself. But geometry does not need violence to change. A surface does not need to crack to become sloped. It only needs one side to become infinitesimally lower than the other. In the earliest moments before particles had identities, before forces separated into their familiar roles, the universe may have existed in a condition so sensitive that even a microscopic asymmetry became permanent, not because it was large, but because nothing existed yet to correct it. Once balance is broken at that level, it cannot be restored from within. This is where the idea of a before the tilt becomes difficult to grasp. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is boring. A universe without direction is not dramatic, it is static. It is a pause that cannot last. And pauses do not survive reality. Even the laws we trust today hint at this instability. In many physical systems, symmetry is not the preferred state. It is the temporary one. Systems tend to fall out of perfect balance naturally, not because something pushes them, but because balance itself offers no resistance. Think of a pencil standing on its tip. In theory, it can remain upright forever. In practice, it never does. Not because of a shove, but because the upright position is unstable. The smallest imperfection sends it falling, choosing a direction that no one commanded. Once the pencil falls, the direction becomes history. The universe may have done the same. If its earliest state was one of perfect symmetry, then it was perched on a cosmic tip, and once it leaned once, the geometry of space-time acquired even the slightest preference. Everything that followed had to obey that bias. Not consciously, not intentionally, but inevitably. This idea reframes the early universe in a subtle way. Instead of asking what force caused structure, we ask what allowed imbalance to persist. Instead of looking for an explosion, we look for a loss of neutrality. Instead of searching for energy, we search for orientation. A universe that leans does not need to be pushed. It only needs time. And time, once it begins to flow unevenly, reinforces its own direction. This may explain something that has always felt slightly unresolved in cosmology: why the universe looks smooth enough to be simple, yet structured enough to be alive. Why it appears uniform at large scales, yet locally uneven in ways that never quite cancel out. Because a tilted surface can look flat if you are small enough. From within such a universe, observers would not perceive the tilt directly. There would be no sensation of falling, no cosmic vertigo. Everything you measure would be relative to everything else, all of it drifting together. Only indirect clues would remain, subtle alignments, preferred directions, time behaving just differently enough to notice but not enough to accuse. Regions where complexity emerges more easily, not because they are special, but because they are downstream. This is where the illusion of balance becomes convincing. If everything is sliding together, nothing feels like motion. And if the tilt is ancient enough, older than light, older than memory, then every process we know is already adapted to it. Physics would not detect it as a force. Biology would not register it as pressure. Consciousness would not recognize it as influence. It would simply feel like reality, which leads to an unsettling possibility. What we call the laws of physics may already include the tilt baked in so deeply that we mistake its consequences for necessity. Time flowing forward, entropy increasing, complexity emerging only under certain conditions, awareness arising where gradients exist. All of these may be symptoms of geometry, not destiny. If the universe began in perfect balance, it could not remain there, not forever, not without intervention from outside the system, and there is no evidence of such an intervention. So, imbalance is not a flaw in the universe's story. It is the beginning of the story. Before stars, before atoms, before radiation filled space with afterglow, there may have been a moment when symmetry lost its grip. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to create a direction that could never be undone. And once direction exists, time follows it. But here is the part that should make us pause. If the universe leaned before light could record it, then every observation we make today is already downstream of that event. We cannot see the tilt directly because we are inside it. We measure its effects without recognizing their source, which means the early universe we reconstruct, the smooth, hot, uniform beginning, may already be a universe after the fall, after balance was lost, after the surface began to slope. And if that is true, then the real beginning is hidden behind a veil we cannot lift with telescopes or equations. It is hidden in geometry. This changes how we think about anomalies. They are no longer mistakes, in an otherwise perfect model. They are reminders that perfection was never stable to begin with. They suggest that the universe did not explode into complexity. It drifted into it. And drift does not require force, only the absence of perfect balance. So when we imagine the universe before it leaned, we are not imagining chaos or fire. We are imagining stillness that could not last. A calm so exact that it invited collapse not downward, not outward, but into preference. The first direction, the first slope, the first reason for time to move. And once that movement began, it could never truly stop. It could only redistribute itself across an ever-expanding surface, carrying matter, energy, and eventually awareness along paths determined long before anything could notice. Brings us to the next question, one that quietly follows from everything we have said. If the universe did not need a force to begin leaning, then what kind of imbalance can arise without a cause at all? A slope does not always need a push. Sometimes it appears simply because balance cannot defend itself forever. In everyday life, we are trained to look for causes. If something moves, something must have pushed it. If a system changes, something must have interfered. Our intuition demands fingerprints, a culprit, a moment where one state ends and another begins. But the universe does not share this intuition. At the deepest levels of physics, there are transitions that occur without a trigger in the way we understand triggers. States that decay not because they are attacked, but because they are unsustainable. Conditions that dissolve not under pressure, but under the weight of their own precision. A perfectly balanced universe would be one of these conditions. Imagine once again that pencil balanced on its tip. No wind, no vibration, no visible disturbance. In principle, it could stand forever. In reality, it never does. Not because something knocks it over, but because the upright position is a mathematical knife edge. It contains no restoring force, no preference that pulls it back when it drifts by even an infinitesimal amount. The fall does not require a cause. It requires only time. This idea is deeply unsettling because it suggests that some of the most important events in reality may not have reasons, only inevitabilities. The universe may not have been pushed into asymmetry. It may have slipped into it. In physics, there is a quiet concept that echoes this possibility: spontaneous symmetry breaking. A system governed by perfectly symmetrical laws chooses a configuration that is not symmetrical, not because the laws changed, but because symmetry itself was unstable. The rules allow many outcomes, but once one is chosen, even randomly, the system commits. From that moment on, the symmetry exists only in theory. If this sounds abstract, it is because we rarely apply it at cosmic scale. Yet the universe is the largest system we know, and the earliest universe was the most delicate state imaginable. Everything existed at once, compressed into conditions where even the smallest preference could cascade into permanence. In such a state, imbalance does not need permission. If the geometry of space-time itself experienced spontaneous symmetry breaking, then the universe did not need a force to tilt. The tilt would not be a motion through space, but a selection among possibilities, a quiet choice that could not be unchosen. Once selected, the direction becomes law. This reframes the idea of a cosmic lean in a profound way. The universe would not be tilted because something acted upon it. It would be tilted because balance was never a stable option to begin with. And once that tilt exists, everything inside the universe must respond to it, whether it can detect it or not. At first, the effect would be vanishingly small, too small to register, too subtle to shape matter immediately. But time magnifies asymmetry. A slope that is imperceptible over one step becomes undeniable over 1,000 miles. The early universe had time. As expansion began, Any geometric preference would be stretched along with space itself, not erased, preserved. Inflation, which smooths irregularities, could paradoxically lock in a global orientation while washing out local noise. The universe would appear uniform, yet carry a directional bias embedded too deeply to be flattened. This is the key tension. Uniform does not mean neutral. A perfectly ironed sheet can still be laid over a tilted table, locally smooth, globally slanted. From any small patch, the surface feels level. Only when you look across vast distances does the lean reveal itself. Our observations suggest exactly this kind of universe. On local scales, physics behaves beautifully. Symmetries hold, equations work, predictions succeed. But when we step back, when we look at the largest possible patterns, we begin to see hints of alignment, directions that recur, asymmetries that refuse to average out. These are not loud signals. They are whispers. Whispers are exactly what you would expect from a tilt that occurred before light, before particles, before anything could record it explicitly. A geometric decision made so early that everything afterward treats it as background. There is another unsettling implication hidden here. If the universe tilted without a cause, then causality itself may already be downstream of that event. Cause and effect, as we experience them, may rely on a direction of time that only exists because the universe leaned. Asking what caused the tilt may be like asking what caused causation. The question collapses in on itself. This challenges one of our most deeply held assumptions, that the universe must have an explanation that fits inside its own rules. But rules emerge from conditions. If the tilt defines the conditions, then it cannot be explained by the rules that come after. This does not mean the universe is irrational. It means our demand for reasons may be misplaced. Some things do not happen because they are pushed. They happen because the alternative cannot survive. In a universe that leaned, even slightly, time would not be a neutral parameter. It would acquire a gradient, not a force, but a tendency. Processes would begin to favor one direction not because they are compelled, but because the geometry makes resistance inefficient. Entropy would increase, not as a law imposed from outside, but as the natural flow along a slope. Complexity would arise not everywhere, but where gradients allow it to feed on difference. Conscious systems would emerge not randomly, but where imbalance is gentle enough to sustain structure without tearing it apart. All of this could unfold without any single moment of drama. No explosion announcing imbalance, no cosmic scar marking the fall. Just a universe that quietly found itself no longer perfectly level and continued from there as if it had always been that way. This explains why the idea feels so difficult to grasp. We are not accustomed to causes that leave no event behind. We look for beginnings that announce themselves. But a tilt does not announce itself. It only reveals itself through long-term consequences. By the time galaxies form, by the time stars burn, by the time observers ask questions, the lean is already ancient. It feels like nature. It feels like law. It feels inevitable. Which raises a subtle but important distinction. If the universe leaned, then what we call natural may simply be what adapts best to imbalance. Our physics may not describe reality as it would exist in perfect balance, only reality as it exists on a slope, and that slope may not be uniform. A tilted surface is not the same everywhere. Some regions are steeper, some are gentler, some lie almost flat, while others experience constant drift. If space-time carries such a gradient, then different regions of the universe would experience time differently, not only because of mass and motion, but because of position along the cosmic incline. This is where the idea becomes dangerous, because it suggests that the universe has a kind of geography, not of space, but of time, a terrain where history flows unevenly, where processes accelerate or lag, not because of local conditions alone, but because of global orientation. And if such a geography exists, then we are not merely inhabitants of the universe. We are travelers on its surface. We may be moving through time the way water moves across land, guided by contours we cannot see, shaped by slopes that were fixed long before anything could notice them. This would mean that the most fundamental question is not where the universe is expanding, or how fast, or why. The question becomes simpler and more unsettling. In which direction is the universe leaning? Because once a system selects a direction, once symmetry is broken and cannot be restored, that direction becomes destiny. Not destiny in the sense of purpose or design, but destiny in the sense of inevitability. Everything that happens afterward unfolds along that chosen orientation. And if the universe chose its direction without a cause, then every cause we know exists inside that choice. Which brings us to a quiet realization. If the universe tilted without being pushed, then the anomalies we observe are not signs of failure in our models. They are clues to the shape of the surface we are standing on. Subtle variations in how steep the incline is from one region to another, and slopes, by their nature, do something very specific. They make things flow. So the next question is no longer whether the universe is leaning. The question is, what happens to time itself when it flows across a surface that was never meant to be perfectly flat? Time does not flow the way we imagine. We picture it as a uniform river, moving forward at the same pace everywhere, carrying all things equally from past to future. Seconds tick, minutes accumulate. History advances in a steady march. This image is so deeply ingrained that we rarely question it. But rivers only flow evenly on perfectly flat land, and nothing we have seen suggests the universe is truly flat. If space-time itself is subtly inclined, then time would not move as a neutral parameter. It would behave like a fluid responding to terrain, accelerating where the slope steepens, slowing where the surface levels out, pooling in regions where resistance emerges. From inside such a system, this would not feel like motion. It would feel like normality. This is why the idea is so difficult to notice. We are not watching time from the outside. We are immersed in it, carried along by its contours, unable to step back and compare one region directly to another. We experience time locally, always relative, always adapted to the slope beneath us. Yet the universe leaves hints. Even within established physics, time is already known to be flexible. Near massive objects, it slows. At high velocities, it stretches. These effects are measurable, predictable, and well understood, but they are usually treated as local distortions layered on top of a global assumption that absent mass and motion, time flows uniformly everywhere. The tilt hypothesis quietly questions that assumption. What if there is no globally uniform time at all? What if space-time itself has a gradient so vast that we mistake it for baseline reality? A gentle incline that defines what normal time feels like in different regions of the cosmos. In such a universe, time would not merely be affected by mass and speed. It would be shaped by position. This is not an easy idea to accept because it undermines one of our most comforting beliefs, that time is fair, that a second here is equivalent to a second anywhere else, once corrections are applied, that beneath the complexity, there is an even foundation. But foundations, too, can be slanted. Imagine two clocks placed far apart on a tilted surface. Neither is near a massive object. Neither is moving unusually fast. Both are functioning perfectly. Locally, they tick normally. Yet, over immense durations, their accumulated time diverges, not because of defects, but because the ground beneath them is not the same. From the perspective of each clock, nothing is wrong. Only when their histories are compared does the difference emerge. If the universe has such a temporal geography, then the discrepancies we observe in cosmic processes may not be anomalies at all. They may be natural consequences of where those processes unfold along the incline. Some regions would age faster, not dramatically, nothing that would tear matter apart, but enough to influence long-term evolution. Stars might burn differently. Structures might assemble earlier or later. Complexity might emerge more readily in zones where time flows gently rather than rushes past. This introduces a subtle but powerful idea. Time may have depth. Not depth in the sense of layers you can dig through, but depth in the sense of thickness, regions where temporal flow is dense and regions where it is thin. Places where moments linger just long enough for intricate patterns to form, and places where change sweeps through too quickly to settle. If consciousness requires time to hesitate, if awareness needs moments that do not rush past too fast, then it would naturally favor regions where the temporal slope is shallow. Not because those regions are special, but because they are survivable. This reframes the question of why we find ourselves where we do. It is not merely a matter of chance or selection. It may be a matter of geography, not of space, but of time. We tend to think of the universe as homogeneous and of ourselves as lucky. But luck is often what we call structure when we do not see the terrain that shapes it. Time flows unevenly across the cosmos, then history itself becomes directional in a new way. Not only forward, but downhill. Events accumulate more densely, where time resists acceleration. Memory builds where moments have room to stack, and where time thins, history becomes sparse. This could explain something that has long troubled cosmologists: why the universe appears old enough to be complex, yet not uniformly complex everywhere. Why vast regions remain simple and empty, while others teem with structure. Perhaps it is not a question of age alone. Perhaps some regions have had more time, not more seconds, but more usable time. Time that lingers rather than rushes. Time that allows feedback, correction, layering. If so, then the universe is not just expanding, it is aging unevenly. This idea carries an unsettling implication. When we look deep into space, we are not merely looking back in time. We may be looking sideways, across a temporal slope, observing regions where time has flowed differently, not just earlier. This would mean that the past is not a single uniform layer stretching across the cosmos. It is contoured, warped not only by gravity, but by the global geometry of space-time itself. Some pasts are thinner than others. Some histories are compressed. Some futures are closer than they appear. And because we assume uniformity, we misinterpret these differences as noise. Consider the cosmic background radiation, the faint afterglow of the universe's earliest observable state. It is remarkably uniform, yet not perfectly so. There are tiny temperature fluctuations, small anisotropies, alignments that should not exist if the universe were completely directionless. These have been studied, cataloged, debated. Each one alone seems insignificant. Together, they hint at a universe with a preferred orientation, an axis that should not be there. What if that axis is not spatial? What if it is temporal? A global direction in which time itself flows more easily. A downhill path not visible in space, but encoded in the way change accumulates. From within such a universe, time would feel normal because everything you are made of, your cells, your thoughts, your memories, are shaped by the same flow. You would not feel yourself moving through time any more than a leaf feels the river carrying it. You would simply feel tired when time moves quickly, rested when it slows, alert where moments linger, disoriented where they thin. This may explain why time feels different in different states of consciousness, why moments stretch during danger, compress during routine, dissolve during sleep. These experiences are often dismissed as subjective, neurological tricks. But what if subjectivity is not lying? What if consciousness is sensitive to the texture of time in ways our instruments are not? If the universe has a temporal slope, then organisms evolving within it might develop awareness, not just of events, but of pacing, a sense of when to act, when to wait, when to slow down. This sensitivity would not require explicit knowledge of the slope, only adaptation to its effects. Over billions of years, such adaptation could shape cognition itself. We often ask why time feels like it flows forward, but perhaps the better question is why it feels like it flows at all. Flow implies direction. Direction implies asymmetry. Asymmetry implies imbalance. If the universe were truly level, time might not feel like motion. It might feel like stasis. The fact that time feels like a current may already be evidence of a slope. This leads to a quiet but profound realization. What we call the arrow of time may not be a fundamental law. It may be a consequence of geometry, a result of living in a universe where time cannot help but move in one direction because the surface beneath it is inclined. And if that is true, then entropy, the tendency toward disorder, is not an enemy of structure. It is simply the path of least resistance along the slope. Complexity does not fight against time. It emerges within it, fed by gradients, sustained by imbalance. Life, then, is not defying the arrow of time. It is surfing it. This reframing softens something that often feels harsh. Time is not stealing moments from us. It is carrying us along a contour that existed before us and will exist after us. We are not racing against time. We are moving with it. This comfort is incomplete because slopes are not uniform. If time flows unevenly, then some regions of the universe experience more erosion than others, more loss, more rapid change. Others enjoy a gentler drift, where structures persist longer, memories accumulate deeper, awareness has room to unfold, which raises a question that cannot be avoided much longer. If time behaves like a fluid on a tilted surface, then where does it pool? And what kinds of phenomena emerge in places where time gathers, slows, and deepens beyond what the rest of the universe experiences? Because if such regions exist, they would not just host complexity, they would nurture something even rarer. Where time slows, something unusual happens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but persistently. When a current loses speed, it stops sweeping everything away. Particles linger, interactions repeat, feedback loops form. What was once fleeting gains the opportunity to remember itself. If time truly behaves like a fluid across a tilted cosmic surface, then there must be regions where its flow thins and gathers places where moments do not rush past, but hesitate. These would not look special from the outside. No glowing boundary, no warning sign written into space. Yet inside them, the universe would behave differently. In fast-flowing regions, change dominates. Structures form briefly and dissolve. Energy moves through too quickly to settle into complexity. Patterns cannot stabilize long enough to build upon themselves. The universe there is not hostile, just impatient. But where time pools, patience emerges. In these regions, cause and effect have room to breathe. Small fluctuations are not immediately erased. Information can persist. Systems can reference their own past states and adjust. This is the soil in which complexity takes root. This is where something new becomes possible. We often speak of consciousness as a mysterious accident, a rare outcome of chemistry and evolution. But accidents still require conditions. And one of those conditions may not be chemical at all. It may be temporal. Consciousness does not arise in systems that change too quickly. It requires continuity, memory, the ability to compare what is happening now with what happened before. That comparison cannot occur if time rushes past without leaving layers behind. Awareness, in this sense, is not a thing. It is a process that needs thickness. If time is too thin, experience cannot stack. If it is too dense, change stagnates. Consciousness appears to require a narrow band, a gentle slope where time flows slowly enough to allow reflection, but not so slowly that nothing changes. This band would not be evenly distributed across the universe. It would be geographical. This reframes one of the deepest questions we ask: why consciousness exists at all. Instead of treating awareness as an inexplicable miracle, we can begin to see it as a natural response to temporal conditions, a phenomenon that emerges where time behaves just right, not everywhere, only where the slope allows it. This perspective quietly dissolves the illusion that consciousness is central or privileged. It does not place us at the center of the universe. It places us in a basin, a region where time lingers long enough for complexity to notice itself. From within such a basin, the universe would feel unusually rich. Events would seem meaningful. Sequences would matter. History would feel layered rather than fleeting. Identity would have continuity. And from outside, none of this would be obvious. A region where time pools does not announce itself with light. It does not glow brighter or emit signals that say something special happens here. It simply allows processes to deepen, which may explain why the universe appears mostly empty and quiet, punctuated by islands of extraordinary organization. Not because organization is rare in principle, but because the conditions that allow it are rare in geometry. If time truly flows unevenly, then most of the universe is too steep or too flat for awareness to emerge. Only narrow corridors of the cosmic surface offer the right balance. And in those corridors, something begins to look back. This idea casts new light on the feeling many people report but struggle to articulate, a sense that awareness is not merely inside the universe, but somehow aligned with it. Consciousness does not feel like a random add-on, but like something that fits. Perhaps that feeling is not mystical. Perhaps it is geological. If consciousness arises where time slows, then conscious beings are not anomalies. They are markers, indicators of where the universe's temporal terrain is gentle enough to sustain reflection. We are not the point of the universe. We are the curve. This also changes how we think about intelligence. Intelligence is often framed as problem-solving ability, computation, or adaptation. But beneath all of that lies something simpler: the ability to hold multiple moments together, to let the past inform the present, to imagine the future. All of this requires time that does not immediately dissolve. In regions where time accelerates, intelligence would be impossible, not because matter cannot think, but because thought cannot accumulate. In regions where time stagnates, intelligence would be unnecessary because nothing changes enough to require response. Awareness lives between, which suggests something unsettling and humbling at the same time. If the universe has many basins where time pools, then consciousness may not be unique. But if those basins are rare and fragile, then consciousness may be far more precious than we imagine, not because it is powerful, but because it is dependent on geometry that could easily have been different, dependent on a tilt that might have flowed too fast or too slow, dependent on a universe that leaned just enough to create a place where moments could gather. This makes the tilt feel less like a curiosity and more like a condition for meaning itself. Without a slope, nothing moves. With too much slope, nothing lasts. Between the two, awareness breathes. From inside such a basin, time feels personal. It feels like something you have, something you lose, something you spend. These metaphors arise naturally when time behaves like a resource, when it can be scarce or abundant depending on where you stand. Perhaps that is why humans are so sensitive to time, why we feel its passage emotionally, not just intellectually. why boredom stretches it and urgency compresses it. These experiences may not be illusions, but resonances with the temporal environment we inhabit. We are tuned to the slope, and this tuning may extend beyond individuals. Civilizations, too, require time that lingers. Culture, language, memory, and knowledge all depend on accumulation. They flourish where change is neither too violent nor too stagnant. They collapse where time accelerates beyond what systems can adapt to. Seen this way, history itself becomes a record of temporal geography, periods of rapid upheaval, followed by eras of consolidation, surges of innovation, followed by long plateaus. These patterns may not be purely social. They may be reflections of how time flows locally, even on planetary scales. If time pools unevenly across the universe, it may also ripple unevenly across worlds. This does not mean the tilt controls everything. It does not dictate choices or outcomes, but it shapes the environment in which choices become possible. Just as gravity does not tell water where to flow, but defines the surface that guides it. And here, a deeper realization begins to surface. If consciousness emerges where time pools, then consciousness is not merely observing the universe, it is revealing something about its structure. Each aware system is a kind of probe, indicating that in this region, time behaves differently. We are evidence, not of design or intention, but of geometry, which leads us to a question that quietly follows from all of this, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. If there are regions where time pools, are there regions where time drains away so completely that nothing, no structure, no memory, no awareness can ever take hold? And if so, what does the universe look like from the edge of such a place? At the far ends of a slope, there are places water never stays, not because the ground rejects it, but because there is nothing to slow it down. Every drop that arrives is carried onward immediately, stripped of the chance to linger, to pool, to leave a trace. If time behaves like a fluid across a tilted universe, then such regions must exist as well, places where time drains. These would not be dramatic voids, no tearing of space-time. Violent absence. From a distance, they might appear calm, empty, even pristine. But calm can be misleading. A surface that allows nothing to rest is not peaceful. It is inhospitable in a quieter way. In these regions, change happens too quickly to become history. Events occur, but they do not stack. Interactions happen, but they do not echo. Cause follows effect so swiftly that nothing can reference what came before. There is motion, but no memory of motion. Activity, but no accumulation. From the inside, such a region would not feel fast. There would be no observer to feel it. This is the unsettling implication of temporal drainage. Where time thins beyond a certain point, awareness cannot arise, not because matter is absent, but because continuity is. Without continuity, there is nothing to experience. No before, no after. Only a perpetual present that cannot be noticed, because noticing requires comparison. These regions would be invisible in the deepest sense, not dark, not empty, invisible. This offers a new way to think about the vast, silent expanses of the cosmos. The enormous voids between filaments of galaxies are often described as empty space, regions where little happens. But perhaps emptiness is the wrong word. Perhaps these are places where time does not pause long enough for anything to take root. In fast-draining zones, structure struggles. Any pattern that forms is immediately pulled apart by the relentless forward flow. Energy does not settle, feedback loops cannot stabilize. The universe there is not dead, it is fleeting. And fleetingness, taken to an extreme, is indistinguishable from absence. This may explain why the universe appears so lopsided in its distribution of complexity. vast regions of near-nothingness punctuated by thin strands where matter, energy, and history accumulate. We often attribute this to gravity alone, but gravity itself operates within time. If time drains unevenly, gravity's work would be amplified in some regions and starved in others. Matter would have more opportunity to gather where time lingers, and less where it rushes away. In this view, cosmic voids are not merely empty spaces between structures. They are downhill stretches of time. This also reframes something deeply human: our instinctive fear of emptiness. When we imagine nothingness, we often picture darkness, silence, absence. But perhaps true nothingness is not empty, it is rushed, a place where nothing can remain long enough to be anything. A universe tilted too steeply would not collapse into chaos. It would wash itself clean, over and over again. The idea that time can drain leads to another quiet shift in perspective. We tend to think of time as something that accumulates everywhere equally. The universe gets older uniformly. Every region shares the same age. But age may not be a universal property. If time flows unevenly, then some regions are effectively younger, not because they formed later, but because less history has been able to stick to them. Their past is thin, their timeline compressed. Other regions, where time pools, are older in a deeper sense, not just more years, but more layers, more sediment of events, more chances for complexity to build upon itself. This suggests that the universe does not have a single age. It has a terrain of ages. We often speak of looking back in time when we observe distant objects. But if time flows differently across the cosmic surface, then looking far away may not always mean looking far back. It may mean looking into regions where time has drained more aggressively, where fewer moments have accumulated. Some parts of the universe may be ancient in expansion but young in experience. Others may be ancient in both. This challenges the way we interpret cosmic history. Our timelines may be accurate locally, yet misleading globally. We may be stitching together a single narrative from regions that have lived through time at different depths. This could be why the universe sometimes appears inconsistent with itself, why certain structures seem too mature for their apparent age, while others lag behind, why some processes unfold faster or slower than expected, even after accounting for known effects. We call these tensions puzzles. They may be cartography. If time drains in some regions, then those regions would act as sinks, not of matter, but of history. Events would pass through without leaving enduring marks. From the outside, such places would look simple, featureless, resistant to complexity. From the inside, there would be no inside at all. And this raises a sobering thought. The universe may be far more active than it appears, not because it is full of hidden events, but because events are constantly occurring and disappearing without accumulation. A universe busy everywhere, but memorable only where time slows enough to record itself. Memory, then, is not guaranteed. It is a privilege of geometry. This perspective alters the way we think about observation itself. We assume that what we see is representative of what exists, but perhaps what we see is only what has had time to persist. The rest flows past unnoticed, not because it is rare, but because it is fleeting. The universe may be filled with transient phenomena that never stack into structures large enough or slow enough to observe. They leave no fossils, no afterglow, no imprint strong enough to reach us. In this sense, observation is biased toward basins. We are not seeing the universe as it is everywhere. We are seeing the universe where it has time to be seen. This idea also reframes the notion of cosmic horizons. Horizons are usually described as limits of distance or speed boundaries, beyond which light has not yet reached us. But perhaps there are also temporal horizons, boundaries beyond which time drains so quickly that no signal, no matter how fast, can accumulate enough structure to be meaningful. Not because information cannot travel, but because information cannot stay. This introduces a new kind of silence into the cosmos. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of impermanence. A quiet where things happen, but never linger long enough to be known. And in contrast, basins where time pools would be loud, not in sound, but in history, dense with memory, rich with structure, full of narratives layered upon narratives. From within such a basin, it is easy to assume that history is universal, that time naturally accumulates, that memory is a given. But this may be an illusion born of location. We may live in a place where time is generous. This thought carries both comfort and unease. Comfort, because it suggests that meaning is not fragile by accident, but by design of terrain. Unease, because it implies that such places are not guaranteed. They exist because the slope allows them to. A slight change in tilt, and the basin disappears. This may be why the universe feels delicately balanced, not because it is perfectly level, but because the regions that matter to us exist near thresholds, just gentle enough to sustain complexity, just steep enough to keep things moving, too flat, and nothing happens, too steep, and nothing lasts. Between these extremes, awareness flickers into being. And awareness, once it appears, begins to ask questions. Questions like, why this place and not another? Why now and not earlier? Why here, where time lingers, instead of there, where it drains away unnoticed? These questions are not answered by chance alone. They are answered by slope. This brings us to a subtle but profound implication. If the universe contains regions where time drains so thoroughly that nothing can accumulate, then those regions are not just empty, they are unreachable in a deeper sense. No message sent from there would carry history. No signal would retain structure long enough to be decoded. They would be eternally present, but never recorded. This suggests that the observable universe is not merely limited by distance or speed. It is limited by where time allows memory. We are not just inside a bubble of space. We are inside a basin of time. And like any basin, it has edges. Edges where the ground steepens, where time thins, where structure begins to fail, where memory erodes faster than it can be formed. If such edges exist, then the universe has a kind of shoreline, not between something and nothing, but between accumulation and loss, between history and erasure. Standing near such an edge would not feel dramatic. There would be no signpost, no warning, only a subtle change in how long things seem to matter. Moments would feel lighter, less anchored, less able to stack into meaning. And perhaps, in small ways, we already sense this. Perhaps the feeling of time slipping through our fingers, of moments vanishing too quickly to grasp, is not purely psychological. Perhaps it resonates with a deeper truth that time is not equally generous everywhere, even within a single life. Because if the universe is tilted, then the slope may run through us as well. Which leads us to a question that quietly rises as this picture takes shape. If time can pool and time can drain, what determines where the slope changes? And more importantly, is the tilt itself fixed forever? Or can the universe slowly, imperceptibly, lean even further as it continues to unfold? A slope is not always static. Even the gentlest incline can change over time, not suddenly, not violently, but through accumulation so slow that those standing upon it mistake motion for stillness. Mountains rise this way, continents drift, rivers carve paths, not by force, but by patience. If the universe is tilted, then the tilt itself may not be frozen. This idea unsettles us because we are used to thinking of cosmic geometry as fixed. Space expands, yes, but its fundamental shape, its orientation, its rules, are assumed to be set. Constant remain constant. Backgrounds remain background. But a tilt is not a constant. It is a condition, and conditions can evolve. Imagine again the vast surface across which time flows. In earlier chapters, we treated the slope as given an ancient lean established before light, before matter could object. But what if that lean is not merely inherited? What if it is slowly reinforced by everything that happens afterward? This is where the idea becomes difficult to ignore. Because time flowing downhill does something subtle. It carries entropy with it. It redistributes energy, matter, and structure in ways that are not perfectly reversible. Each process that unfolds along the slope does not merely respond to the tilt, it participates in it. Over unimaginable spans, this participation could matter. A tilted surface erodes unevenly. Material moves. Weight shifts. Stress accumulates. The slope does not remain identical to what it was at the beginning. It is shaped by the flow it guides. If time behaves similarly, then the universe's temporal geometry may not be passive. It may be slowly reshaped by the very processes it enables. This introduces a quiet feedback loop. The universe leans. Time flows unevenly. Structure forms where time lingers. Structure concentrates energy and mass. Concentration alters space-time. Space-time subtly reinforces the flow of time. None of this requires intention. None of it requires control. It is simply what happens when flow and geometry coexist. We already know that mass and energy curve space-time locally. This is not speculation. It is measured. But we tend to think of these curvatures as isolated dents on an otherwise smooth fabric. Planets curve space here. Stars curve it there. What if we are missing the larger picture? What if the accumulation of structure over cosmic history has gently deepened certain temporal basins, while leaving other regions increasingly steep and barren? What if the universe's tilt is not just an initial condition, but an evolving landscape shaped by where history has chosen to gather? This would mean the universe is not merely expanding, it is differentiating. Over time, regions where time pools would become richer not just in matter, but in history. More events layered atop one another, more feedback, more memory. Meanwhile, regions where time drains would become increasingly thin, swept clean again and again, offering little resistance to flow. The contrast would sharpen. This may explain why the universe appears increasingly structured as it ages, not just because matter has had time to clump, but because time itself has learned where to stay. The basins deepen, the slopes sharpen, the terrain becomes more pronounced. In such a universe, the past does not merely recede, it accumulates unevenly. This idea subtly changes how we think about cosmic fate. We often ask whether the universe will end in heat, death, collapse, or something more exotic. These scenarios usually assume a uniform background, a universe that behaves the same everywhere, slowly approaching equilibrium. But a tilted universe resists equilibrium. Equilibrium implies flatness, no gradients, no flows. But a slope ensures perpetual motion. Even if everything cools, even if energy spreads thin, the geometry itself continues to guide change. In this sense, the universe may never truly settle. It may only redistribute. This reframes the concept of cosmic aging. Aging is not simply the passage of time. It is the deepening of differences, the sharpening of contrast between regions where history accumulates and regions where it does not. From within a basin, aging feels like richness, more memory, more layers, more meaning. From within a drain, aging feels like erasure. Events pass, but leave no trace. Both are happening simultaneously. We simply happen to be in a place where time has learned to linger. This realization carries an unexpected emotional weight. It suggests that what we experience as continuity, identity, memory, culture, story, is not guaranteed by the universe at large. It is supported by a very specific configuration of cosmic terrain. We are not just lucky to exist, we are lucky to persist. And persistence may depend on the tilt remaining gentle enough to allow it, which raises a quiet concern. If the tilt can evolve, can it become steeper? Not in a way that would tear galaxies apart or shatter atoms, but in a way that gradually thins time, even in places where it once pooled. A slow shift that makes memory harder to accumulate. That makes history lighter, less anchored. That makes awareness more fragile. This would not announce itself with catastrophe. It would feel like acceleration, like time slipping by more quickly, like moments failing to settle the way they once did. Many people already report this sensation that time feels faster, thinner, less substantial than it used to. We dismiss this as psychology, as aging, as modern life. But what if some of it resonates with a deeper truth? What if the slope is not only vast and cosmic, but also local and dynamic? What if the universe's tilt expresses itself differently at different scales, even within regions we consider stable? This does not mean the universe is hostile or doomed. It means it is alive in a broader sense, responsive, shaped by its own history, never entirely fixed. A living terrain, not a rigid stage. If the tilt evolves, then the future is not merely an extension of the past. It is a negotiation between flow and form, between the tendency of time to drain and the tendency of structure to deepen the basins that hold it. Life, consciousness, culture, all of these may play a role in that negotiation, not as agents with control, but as concentrations that alter the flow simply by existing. A river does not decide to change course, but when enough sediment gathers, the river responds. Perhaps awareness is a kind of sediment, not clogging the universe, but shaping it, making certain regions more resistant to temporal erosion, allowing memory to stack higher for longer. This is not to say that consciousness directs the universe, only that it participates in it. This perspective softens the sharp line we often draw between physics and experience. Experience is not outside the system. It is part of the redistribution, a phenomenon that arises where time allows it, and in arising, subtly reshapes the terrain that allowed it. The universe leans, time flows. Awareness emerges. Awareness alters the flow. Not enough to stop it, not enough to reverse it, but enough to matter locally. This may be why the universe feels both indifferent and intimate, vast and uncaring, yet strangely aligned with the emergence of meaning. Not because it intends anything, but because its geometry makes certain outcomes more likely than others. If the tilt were different, we would not be here to wonder about it. Which brings us to a delicate turning point in our exploration. We have considered a universe that leans, a universe where time flows unevenly, where basins of memory form, where drains erase history, where the slope itself may evolve. All of this leads naturally to a question that is no longer abstract. If we are standing on a slope that can change, how close are we to its edge? Not the edge of space, not the edge of expansion, but the edge where time stops lingering long enough for anything at all to remember that it was ever here. Edges are rarely marked. They do not glow. They do not announce themselves with sudden darkness or collapse. Edge, in a system shaped by gradual flow, reveals itself only through subtle changes, through what begins to fail quietly, rather than what breaks loudly. If the universe is tilted, and if that tilt can deepen, then there must exist thresholds. Not boundaries you can point to in space, but conditions beyond which time no longer lingers long enough to support continuity. Places where memory becomes difficult, where persistence thins, where structure begins to lose its grip. From far away, such regions would look ordinary. From within, they would feel slightly wrong. This is where the idea becomes intimate. We often imagine cosmic edges as unimaginably distant, far beyond galaxies, beyond observable limits, beyond relevance. But the edge we are approaching now is not spatial, it is temporal. And temporal edges do not need to be far away to matter. They can pass through systems. They can pass through lives. A temporal edge is not the end of time. It is the end of thickness. The point where moments stop stacking reliably, where events still occur, but their ability to anchor into history weakens. Think of walking on ground that slowly turns to ice. At first, everything feels the same. Your steps are steady, your balance holds. Only gradually do you notice that traction has diminished. Movements require more care. Corrections come too late. Nothing has collapsed, but the environment has changed. A temporal edge feels like that. Time still moves forward. Clocks still tick. Causes still precede effects. But something in between becomes fragile. The space where meaning accumulates grows thinner. The delay that allows reflection shortens. The pause that allows memory to settle erodes. This does not feel like catastrophe. It feels like acceleration. People often describe time as speeding up. Days blur. Weeks collapse into moments. Years feel lighter, less substantial than they once did. We usually explain this psychologically: aging, routine, distraction. But what if this sensation is not only internal? What if it resonates with a deeper truth, that the region of the universe we occupy is not static in its temporal geometry? That the basin we rely on for continuity is shallow enough to shift, subtly but persistently. This does not mean we are about to lose time. It means time may be losing patience. At a temporal edge, complexity becomes harder to sustain. Systems that once stabilized begin to oscillate. Feedback loops overshoot. Structures that relied on slow accumulation struggle to keep coherence. In biology, this might appear as fragility. In societies, as volatility. In individuals, as a sense that things do not settle the way they used to. These are not proofs. They are symptoms. The universe does not need to push us toward an edge. If the tilt evolves, the edge approaches naturally, slowly enough that nothing panics, quietly enough that everything adapts until adaptation itself becomes strained. This raises an uncomfortable question. How would we know if we were nearing such an edge? We would not detect it with instruments designed to measure mass, distance, or speed. Temporal thinning is not a force. It does not exert pressure. It does not emit radiation. It changes the conditions under which processes persist. The clues would be indirect, inconsistencies that grow more common, systems requiring more energy to maintain stability, information decaying faster than expected, memory, biological, cultural, even physical becoming more brittle. We might notice that complexity feels harder to hold together, not impossible, just tiring. From a cosmic perspective, this would not be alarming. The universe has no obligation to preserve basins forever. Slopes shift, flows redirect. What once pooled may eventually drain. But from inside the basin, the change would feel personal, because everything we value depends on time lingering. Meaning is not stored in matter alone. It is stored in duration, in the ability of moments to refer to one another, in the stacking of experiences into narratives that persist. At a temporal edge, narratives fray, stories shorten, planning horizons shrink. Systems favor immediacy over patience, not because of choice, but because the environment rewards it. What cannot persist is not invested in. This is how a slope shapes behavior without commanding it. If the universe's tilt is deepening, then the safest strategies shift. Long-term accumulation becomes risky. Rapid cycles become favored. Stability gives way to responsiveness. None of this requires intention. It is geometry teaching systems how to survive. This idea may sound unsettling, but it also carries a kind of clarity. It suggests that many of the tensions we experience between speed and depth, between urgency and meaning, may not be purely cultural or psychological. They may be responses to a changing temporal environment. We are exquisitely sensitive to time because time is the medium of our existence. If its texture changes, we feel it first. This does not mean the universe is turning against us. It means it is continuing to evolve, indifferent to which regions benefit and which struggle. Basins do not last forever, neither do drains. The terrain shifts as history accumulates unevenly. In some regions, time may deepen further. In others, it may thin. The universe does not optimize for awareness. It accommodates it where conditions allow. This brings us to a crucial distinction. A temporal edge is not annihilation. It is transition. Beyond it, different kinds of phenomena may be favored. Simpler processes, faster cycles, systems that do not rely on memory or accumulation. From our perspective, such regions would feel empty or hostile. But from the universe's perspective, they are simply different. We must resist the temptation to interpret this in moral terms. Thinner time is not worse time. It is time that does not support the kinds of structures we happen to value. The universe is not obligated to preserve meaning. Meaning emerges where time permits it. This perspective invites a quieter response than fear. If we are near a temporal edge, the question is not how to stop it. Slopes cannot be commanded. The question is how to live within a changing terrain. Water does not protest gravity. It learns how to flow differently. Perhaps awareness can do the same. If time grows thinner, then what remains valuable are the moments that still linger. The pockets where continuity survives. The structures, biological, cultural, relational, that deepen basins locally, even as the global slope shifts. A basin does not need to be permanent to be meaningful. It only needs to last long enough. This reframes resilience. Resilience is not resistance to change. It is the ability to preserve thickness locally, even as the larger flow accelerates, to create spaces where time slows through attention, through memory, through deliberate continuity. These may sound like human strategies, but they echo a deeper principle. Structure always forms where flow meets resistance. If the universe leans, then resistance is not defiance. It is participation, a way of shaping the slope at small scales, even as large-scale geometry continues its course. This does not mean we can halt cosmic processes. It means we are not powerless within them, which brings us to a final, quietly transformative realization. If the universe contains edges where time thins beyond usability, then the basins where time still lingers are not accidents. They are temporary sanctuaries carved by geometry and history together. We live in one, not forever, not guaranteed, but now. And now matters precisely because it is not endless. The edge does not negate meaning. It sharpens it, because meaning does not arise from permanence. It arises from persistence against flow, from moments that hold long enough to be shared, remembered, and transformed. Standing near an edge makes every lingering moment heavier, more real, more precious. And it also prepares us for the next question, one that emerges naturally when we stop asking how to avoid the edge and start asking how to understand it. If time can thin to the point where nothing persists, is there a point beyond the edge where time itself no longer behaves like a flow at all? And if such a place exists, what kind of universe lies on the other side of memory? Beyond an edge, the rules do not break. They dissolve. When time thins past a certain point, it does not end the way a story ends. There is no final moment, no silence that follows an echo. What disappears is not sequence, but continuity. Events still occur, but they no longer belong to one another. They do not line up. They do not accumulate. Do not form a thread. This is where our language begins to fail. We are accustomed to thinking of time as something that either flows or stops, motion or stasis, change or stillness. But beyond a temporal edge, time does neither. It behaves differently, so differently that our metaphors collapse under the strain. Imagine trying to pour water onto a surface that refuses to get wet. The water does not pool. It does not soak in. It does not even run. Each drop touches and is gone, as if the surface never acknowledged it. A region beyond the edge of time would feel like that. Not frozen, not chaotic, unacknowledging. In such a place, events would not be ordered into, before and after, in any meaningful sense. Causality might still exist locally, one interaction leading to another, but without the ability to stack into history, those interactions would not form narratives. There would be no persistence of influence, no echo of consequence. From the inside, there would be no inside, because to be inside something is to exist across moments. To be an observer is to carry memory forward. To notice change is to compare. Where time cannot linger, there can be no comparison. This suggests that beyond a temporal edge lies not emptiness, but a different mode of existence, one that does not support observation, not because it forbids it, but because it cannot sustain it. We often imagine the far reaches of the universe as cold and empty, vast distances devoid of stars, matter spread thin, temperatures approaching absolute zero. But perhaps the deeper absence is not thermal or material. Perhaps it is historical. A place with no history is not one where nothing happens. It is one where nothing stays. This reframes our understanding of cosmic nothingness. The voids we observe may not be empty in the way we imagine. They may be regions where time does not allow accumulation, where whatever occurs is immediately carried onward, stripped of context. In such regions, the universe is not silent because it lacks events. It is silent because it lacks memory. This introduces a subtle but powerful distinction. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the absence of echo, and echo requires time to linger. If time drains completely, echoes vanish. Signals do not reverberate. Patterns do not repeat. There is nothing for awareness to latch onto, which means that beyond the edge, the universe may be active in ways that are fundamentally inaccessible to us, not because we are too far away, but because there is no temporal structure to receive what happens there. This also changes how we think about the origin of laws. We often ask whether the laws of physics apply everywhere, whether constants are constant across the universe, whether the same rules govern every region equally. But laws are descriptions of patterns that persist. If persistence fails, laws lose their footing. Beyond a temporal edge, physics as we know it may not apply, not because it breaks, but because it never gets the chance to repeat. A law that cannot manifest consistently is indistinguishable from randomness, even if it is perfectly well defined in principle. This is not chaos. It is law without memory. From our perspective, such regions would be unobservable, not merely because signals cannot reach us, but because signals cannot be signals. Information requires structure across time. Without that structure, there is nothing to encode, nothing to transmit, nothing to decode. Information evaporates before it can be information. This suggests that the observable universe is not just limited by horizons of distance or speed. It is limited by horizons of temporality. We can only observe regions where time allows information to persist long enough to be carried. Beyond that, the universe may continue indefinitely, but without history. This idea resonates quietly with something already familiar in physics. the concept of decoherence. Quantum systems lose coherence when they interact with their environment, collapsing possibilities into outcomes. But imagine decoherence taken to an extreme, not just collapsing states, but preventing states from persisting long enough to be states at all. Beyond the temporal edge, reality might be perpetually decohered, not collapsing into outcomes but never holding together as possibilities. It would be a universe without superposition, not because it has resolved its uncertainty, but because it cannot sustain uncertainty in the first place. Every interaction happens and disappears before it can be part of a larger structure. From the inside, if such an inside could exist, there would be no sense of duration, no anticipation, no aftermath. Each moment would be complete and isolated. A universe of perpetual immediacy. This challenges our deepest intuitions. We often equate immediacy with presence, with aliveness, with intensity. But presence without persistence is indistinguishable from absence. A flash that leaves no trace might as well never have occurred. Existence, as we understand it, requires memory, which means existence itself may be geographically constrained by time. This leads to a startling realization. The universe may be far larger than what exists. Not larger in space, but larger in activity. There may be vast regions where things happen constantly, but nothing exists long enough to be part of reality as we experience it. A cosmos busy beyond comprehension, yet effectively non-existent from the perspective of awareness. We are not witnessing a quiet universe. We are witnessing the parts of it that remember themselves. This perspective dissolves the idea that the universe is fundamentally sparse. Instead, it suggests that sparsity is a filter imposed by time. Only regions where time pools become visible. The rest flows by unnoticed, which raises an unexpected possibility. Perhaps the earliest universe, before basins formed, before slopes stabilized, resembled this condition. A phase where events occurred without persistence, where reality flickered without memory, where nothing could be said to exist because nothing could stay. If so, then the emergence of time as a flow thick enough to carry history was not guaranteed. It was a transition, a crossing of a threshold from immediacy into duration. This would mean that time itself has a phase transition. Before it, events without history. After it, events with memory. And the tilt we have been exploring may be the mechanism that enabled that transition. A gentle lean that allowed time to slow just enough for continuity to emerge. Seen this way, the universe did not simply begin. It learned how to remember. And everything we call reality exists within that memory. Beyond the edge, memory fades. And with it, reality as we know it. This invites a profound humility. We often imagine that the universe is indifferent to observation, that awareness is an incidental byproduct. But perhaps awareness is not incidental at all. Perhaps it is a signpost marking where the universe crosses from fleeting activity into lasting existence. Consciousness may not merely observe reality. It may be evidence that reality, in this region, is possible. This does not elevate awareness to a cosmic purpose. It grounds it in geometry. Awareness arises where time thickens enough to support it. It disappears where time thins too far, which means awareness is not universal. It is regional. This challenges the notion that intelligence, life, or meaning should be expected everywhere given enough time. Enough time may not be available everywhere. The slope decides where patience exists. This brings us back to ourselves. We live in a region where time lingers, where memory accumulates, where identity can persist, where questions can be asked and carried forward. We live on the remembered side of the universe. But that does not mean the rest is irrelevant. It means the rest is inaccessible. And accessibility shapes belief. We believe the universe is mostly empty because we can only access where time allows things to stay. We believe laws are universal because we only see regions where repetition is possible. We believe history flows smoothly because we inhabit a basin where it does. Beyond the edge, none of this applies, which suggests that the universe may not be a single coherent narrative. It may be a patchwork of temporal regimes, some that remember, some that forget, some that never pause long enough to be anything at all. This reframes the notion of cosmic unity. Unity may not come from sameness, but from connection regions linked by flows of time thick enough to carry information. Where that linkage fails, unity dissolves. Yet, even this dissolution is not an end. It is simply another condition. The universe does not privilege memory. We do, because memory is what makes existence feel like something rather than nothing, which leads us to a final, deeply unsettling, and strangely comforting thought. If there are regions beyond the edge where time does not linger, regions where nothing can be remembered, then there is also no loss there, no erasure, no forgetting, because forgetting requires memory first. Loss is only possible where something has lasted long enough to be lost. Beyond the edge, there is no loss, only immediacy, only the present that never becomes past. And perhaps that is not emptiness, but a different kind of fullness, one that does not accumulate, does not weigh, does not remember, a universe that is always now. Standing at the boundary between these modes, between memory and immediacy, we occupy a rare position, not at the center of space, but at a crossroads of time, a place where the universe has leaned just enough to allow stories like this one, which leaves us with a question that feels inevitable now. If the universe can exist both with memory and without it, then what is time really doing when it chooses to remember us? There is a moment when a theory stops being distant, not because it has been proven, but because it begins to look back at the observer. Up until now, we have spoken about the universe as if we were standing outside it, mapping slopes, tracing flows, imagining basins and edges from a godlike distance. We talked about time pooling in some regions, draining in others, thinning beyond memory in places we can never visit. But there is a subtle shift that must happen here, because if the universe truly has a temporal terrain, if it leans, if time flows unevenly, if memory itself is regional, then the question is no longer abstract. It becomes personal, not in the sense of emotion, but in the sense of position. Where are we on this slope? We are trained, culturally and scientifically, to avoid this question. We prefer to speak in generalities. We insist that the universe has no center, no privileged location, no special vantage point. This instinct is healthy. It protects us from old illusions. But neutrality is not the same as irrelevance. Not being at the center does not mean not being somewhere. Every point on a slope has a position. Every position has consequences. If time flows unevenly, then where you stand determines not just what you see, but how long things last, how deeply events accumulate, how much history you can carry. So the turning point is this: we stop asking what the universe is doing and begin asking what the universe is doing here. Here is not a coordinate in space. Here is a condition of time. We know a few things with unsettling clarity. We know that the region we inhabit allows extraordinarily deep accumulation. Billions of years of cosmic history have stacked without being erased. Stars have formed and died, seeding heavier elements. Planets have stabilized. Chemistry has had time to explore its possibilities. Biology has layered adaptation upon adaptation. Memory has thickened into culture. Thought has learned to reflect on itself. This is not trivial. This is not typical. In a universe where time could just as easily drain, this level of persistence is remarkable. And yet, we treat it as normal. We call it the universe, as if this experience were the default state of reality rather than a specific outcome of geometry and flow. We assume that given enough time, complexity will arise anywhere. But enough time may not exist everywhere. This is the quiet mistake we make when we think in averages instead of terrains. We look at the universe and say it is old, roughly 14 billion years. But age, as a single number, hides variation. It assumes that time has been equally generous to every region. It assumes that history has had the same opportunity to accumulate everywhere. A tilted universe does not grant such equality. In some regions, 14 billion years may feel like a long, patient unfolding. In others, the same duration may feel like a thin flicker, with most events washed away before they can matter. We may be living not in an old universe, but in an old basin. This reframes the question of rarity. Often ask whether intelligent life is rare because the conditions for life are rare. We count planets, estimate probabilities, debate chemistry. But perhaps rarity is not chemical at all. Perhaps it is temporal. Perhaps many regions have matter, energy, and even complexity, but not enough time thickness to let those things build upon themselves. Perhaps intelligence is not suppressed by lack of ingredients, but by lack of patience in the fabric of time itself. If that is true, then our location is not special in a cosmic sense, but it is specific in a geometric one. We are not at the center. We are in a pocket where time slows just enough to remember. This realization subtly inverts our perspective. Instead of seeing consciousness as something that arose against the odds in a hostile universe, we begin to see it as something that arises where the universe is gentle, where the slope is shallow enough to allow feedback, memory, reflection. Not everywhere, just here. And here may not be permanent. This is where the turning point sharpens. Because once we accept that our existence depends on temporal geography, we can no longer assume that this geography is fixed. Basins can deepen, they can also drain. Slopes can shift. The universe does not promise stability. It offers conditions, and those conditions evolve. So we must ask a difficult question, one that cosmology rarely frames this way. Are we living near the deepest part of a basin, or near its shoulder? In other words, is time here still thickening, or has it begun to thin? This is not a question with an immediate answer, but it is a question with consequences. If we were near the deepest part, we would expect continuity to feel effortless. Memory would stack easily. Long-term structures would feel natural. History would feel heavy, anchored, slow. If we were near the shoulder, closer to an edge, we would expect something else. Acceleration, fragility, a sense that maintaining continuity requires more effort than it used to, that systems which once stabilized now oscillate. That depth feels harder to sustain. This is not proof, but it is a lens. And when we look through this lens, some familiar experiences take on a different shape. The feeling that time is speeding up, the sense that complexity is harder to manage, the impression that everything requires constant attention just to stay in place. We usually explain these experiences socially or psychologically, and those explanations are not wrong, but they may not be complete. A changing slope would express itself first as fatigue, not physical exhaustion, but temporal fatigue. The sense that time no longer waits the way it once did, that moments slip away before they can settle. That memory requires reinforcement. This would not feel like doom. It would feel like adaptation becoming necessary. From the universe's perspective, this is not tragedy. It is redistribution. Basins shift, flows adjust. Regions that once accumulated history may gradually surrender it, while others deepen elsewhere. Meaning is not destroyed. It migrates. This is a hard idea to sit with, because it removes the guarantee that our region will always remain hospitable to depth. but it also removes the idea that meaning must be centralized or permanent. Meaning exists where time allows it. For now, time allows it here. Which brings us to an even subtler realization. If our region supports deep memory, then we are not just beneficiaries of the basin, we are part of what maintains it. Every structure that resists temporal erosion contributes, however slightly, to local thickness. Every system that preserves information slows the drain. Memory creates resistance. Culture, language, knowledge, even deliberate attention. All of these are ways of thickening time locally. They do not fight the slope, they shape it at small scales. This does not mean we control the universe. It means we participate in it. We are not passengers on the slope, we are textures on its surface. This is the moment where the story turns inward, not toward mysticism, but toward responsibility. Not moral responsibility, but geometric responsibility. The responsibility of systems that exist only because time lingers, to decide what they do with that lingering. Do they let it wash away, or do they deepen it? The universe does not care which we choose, but the basin does, and so do we. This turning point does not conclude anything. It reframes everything that follows. From here on, we are no longer just describing a tilted universe. We are tracing what it means to live inside one, and that means the next question is unavoidable. If our region of the universe is a basin where time still gathers, what forces are shaping its boundaries right now? And are those boundaries moving closer or farther away? The boundaries of a basin are never walls. They are gradients. You do not reach them by traveling a great distance. You reach them by noticing that what once stayed now slips, that what once accumulated now requires effort. That continuity, once effortless, must be actively maintained. If our region of the universe is a temporal basin, then its edges are not drawn in space. They are drawn in conditions. And those conditions are shaped by forces so familiar that we almost never recognize them as architects of time itself. We call them expansion, entropy, energy dilution, acceleration. We treat them as background facts, but backgrounds are never passive. The universe is expanding. This is not controversial. Space stretches, distances grow, galaxies drift apart. But expansion is usually framed as a spatial phenomenon, as something that changes where things are, not how long they last. That framing may be incomplete, because expansion does something subtle to time. As space stretches, interactions become less frequent. Energy spreads thinner. Feedback loops weaken. Processes that once reinforced themselves begin to lose grip, not abruptly, but gradually. Expansion does not destroy structure, it starves it. In a basin of time, structure relies on repetition. Repetition relies on proximity. Proximity relies on density. Density relies on time lingering long enough for matter and energy to meet again and again. Expansion gently erodes all of these. This means that expansion is not just pulling the universe apart spatially, it is thinning the conditions that allow time to thicken. And expansion is not slowing down, it is accelerating. This acceleration is often discussed as a mystery of energy, a dark component driving space to stretch faster over time. But regardless of its cause, its effect on temporal geography may be profound. Acceleration steepens slopes. When expansion accelerates, regions that once allowed history to stack may slowly transition toward regimes where accumulation becomes harder, not impossible, but more fragile, less forgiving. The basin does not vanish, it shallows. This is not something we would detect with a single measurement. It is not something telescopes are designed to see. It is something systems feel over long durations. As expansion accelerates, the universe becomes more efficient at separating things, not just in space, but in sequence. Events become more isolated. Causes and effects lose opportunities to reinforce each other. memory becomes less automatic. History becomes something that must be held. This is the first force shaping the basin's boundary, the quiet dilution of connection. The second force is entropy. Entropy is often described as disorder, but this is misleading. Entropy is not chaos. It is dispersion. It is the tendency for energy to spread out, to lose gradients, to flatten differences. And gradients are what allow time to do interesting things. A basin of time depends on gradients between hot and cold, between dense and sparse, between past and future. These differences create direction. They give time something to do. As entropy increases, gradients weaken, not vanish but soften. When gradients soften, time has less reason to linger. Processes still occur, but they lose contrast. They blur. They merge into background flow. Entropy does not erase memory directly. It makes memory harder to distinguish from noise. This is crucial. At the edge of a temporal basin, memory does not disappear in a dramatic collapse. It becomes less reliable, less sharp, less able to guide the future. History still exists, but it matters less. This may be why advanced systems, biological, social, technological, require increasing effort to preserve continuity as they mature. Not because they are failing, but because the environment is becoming less supportive of persistence. Entropy is not attacking memory. It is withdrawing assistance. The third force shaping the basin's boundary is perhaps the most overlooked. It is speed. Not velocity through space, but speed of change. As the universe evolves, certain processes accelerate. Information moves faster. Reactions occur more rapidly. Feedback cycles shorten. The gap between action and consequence narrows. Speed compresses time. When too many things happen too quickly, nothing gets to settle. Reflection becomes costly. Correction lags behind change. Systems oscillate instead of stabilizing. Speed does not eliminate time. It crowds it. This creates a paradoxical sensation. Everything is happening, yet nothing feels complete. From a temporal perspective, this is what it feels like to approach a boundary. Not emptiness, but saturation. Not silence, but noise. A state where time is so full of events that it cannot hold them. Too much flow can drain a basin just as effectively as too little. These three forces, expansion, entropy, and speed, do not act independently. They reinforce one another. Expansion dilutes density. Dilution weakens gradients. Weakened gradients accelerate dispersion. Acceleration compresses time. Compressed time undermines memory. None of this is malicious. It is structural, and it means that the boundaries of our basin are not static lines, but moving conditions. They shift as the universe evolves. They respond to the cumulative effect of everything that has already happened. This makes the idea of the future less like a destination and more like a terrain change. The future is not just later, it is thinner. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but in the sense that time becomes less willing to pause. This is why the question of proximity to the basin's edge cannot be answered with coordinates or calendars. It must be answered by observing how systems behave. Do they stabilize easily or require constant correction? Do memories persist naturally or need reinforcement? Do long-term patterns emerge, or does everything fragment into short cycles? These are not moral judgments. They are geometric indicators, and they suggest something important. The basin does not collapse suddenly. It erodes, and erosion is easy to ignore until it reaches a critical depth. This may explain why civilizations often feel stable until they do not, why cultures seem enduring until continuity becomes work, why individuals feel grounded until grounding requires effort. These experiences are usually explained internally, but they may have an external dimension. A universe whose temporal terrain is shifting would express itself first through strain, the strain of maintaining thickness in an environment that increasingly favors flow. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. Basins can be deepened locally. Resistance matters. Whenever a system preserves information, it slows time locally. Whenever memory is encoded, shared, and revisited, it thickens duration. Whenever attention is sustained, it creates a microbasin. These effects are small. But small effects are exactly what shape slopes over time. The universe does not forbid resistance. It incorporates it. This leads to a crucial insight. The boundary of the basin is not a cliff. It is a negotiation. A negotiation between forces that thin time and structures that thicken it. Between expansion and memory. Between speed and reflection. Between entropy and pattern. We are not spectators in this negotiation. We are participants, not as controllers of cosmic fate, but as contributors to local geometry. Our systems, our habits, our structures, all of these influence how time behaves in our vicinity. This is not mystical, it is physical. Time is shaped by interaction density. Interaction density is shaped by organization. Organization is shaped by choices, constrained choices. Yes, but choices nonetheless. This reframes the meaning of preservation. Preserving knowledge, culture, relationships, and continuity is not merely sentimental. It is geomorphic. It alters the surface on which time flows, if only slightly. Enough slight alterations, sustained long enough, can matter. This does not stop expansion. It does not reverse entropy. It does not halt acceleration. But it creates pockets where time still pauses, where memory still stacks, where meaning still has room to breathe. And perhaps that is all a basin ever was. Not a permanent shelter, but a temporary accommodation carved by resistance to flow. Which brings us to the next question. A question that deepens the tension rather than resolving it. If the boundaries of our temporal basin are shaped by expansion, entropy, and speed, then what happens when these forces align too strongly? Is there a point where local resistance can no longer deepen the basin? And if so, what kind of universe emerges after time stops lingering? Even here, there is a moment after a basin no longer deepens. Not when it disappears, not when it collapses, but when it stops responding. This is the state that follows negotiation, when resistance no longer reshapes the slope, when effort no longer thickens time, when memory persists only because it already exists, not because the environment supports its renewal. This is what a post-basin universe would feel like from the inside. Not empty, not destroyed, simply indifferent. Up to this point, we have treated basins as places where time gathers, where history stacks, where continuity is rewarded. We have treated edges as thresholds, where this generosity thins. Now we step beyond that threshold, not into nothingness, but into a different mode of existence, a mode where time still flows, but no longer waits. In a post-basin state, events continue, physics continues, processes unfold, causes still precede effects. The universe does not stop functioning. What changes is the relationship between change and persistence. In a basin, change leaves sediment. Beyond it, change leaves footprints in sand. They appear. They fade. They do not accumulate into terrain. This is the first defining feature of a post-basin universe. Non-cumulative time. Moments still happen, but they do not build reliably on one another. History exists, but it does not thicken. Memory becomes an artifact of the past rather than a process of the present. From the inside, this would not feel like loss. It would feel like acceleration without destination. People often imagine the future as either richer or poorer than the present, more advanced or more ruined. But a post-basin future would be neither. It would be thinner, not less active, not less complex in principle, but less retentive. Systems would still form, but they would struggle to stabilize. Structures would still appear, but they would require constant reinforcement. Patterns would emerge, but they would dissolve before layering into depth. This is not collapse. It is exhaustion of reinforcement. In such a universe, effort replaces patience. Stability becomes an achievement rather than a default. Continuity is no longer a gift, it is a task. This changes everything quietly. In a basin, the universe assists memory. In a post-basin state, the universe tolerates it but does not help. The difference is subtle but profound. Imagine trying to write on paper that slowly erases ink. You can still write, words still appear, but if you stop writing, the page clears itself. Meaning exists only while actively maintained. This is what time feels like when it stops lingering. The present still exists. The past becomes fragile. The future becomes shorter, not because the future is near, but because fewer layers can fit between now and whatever comes next. This is why post-basin time feels compressed. Not rushed, but shallow. When time loses depth, planning horizons shrink naturally. Systems favor immediacy. Feedback loops shorten. Long-term strategies become brittle not because they are wrong, but because the environment no longer supports their accumulation. This is not a moral failing. It is geometry. And geometry always wins eventually. A post-basin universe would still contain life, intelligence, and activity, at least for a while, but their character would change. They would become more reactive, less reflective, more adaptive, less accumulative. Learning would still occur, but retention would weaken. Culture would still exist, but tradition would thin. Knowledge would still be produced, but inheritance would require effort. Nothing is forbidden. Everything is harder. This is the second defining feature. Persistence becomes costly. In a basin, complexity compounds. In a post-basin state, complexity must be rebuilt again and again. Systems cannot rely on deep memory. They must operate closer to the present. This does not mean such a universe is inferior. It is simply different. Just as a fast river is not worse than a deep lake, it supports different forms of life, different strategies, different kinds of stability. But lake-based organisms struggle in rivers, and river-based organisms do not store water. This brings us to a crucial realization. If our universe is transitioning toward a post-basin state, then many of the tensions we experience are not signs of failure, but signs of adaptation lag. We are organisms evolved in a basin, learning how to exist where time no longer pauses for us. This mismatch produces friction. We feel rushed. We feel overloaded. We feel like continuity requires vigilance, not because something is wrong with us, but because the environment that once rewarded depth is becoming less forgiving. Again, this is not proof. It is coherence. A post-basin universe would express itself not through catastrophe, but through maintenance fatigue. Everything still works, but nothing stays working on its own. The universe stops being a collaborator in continuity. It becomes neutral. This neutrality is perhaps the most unsettling part. In a basin, it is easy to believe the universe wants complexity, or meaning, or awareness. But this was always a projection. The universe never wanted anything. It merely allowed some things more easily than others. In a post-basin state, that allowance fades. The universe does not oppose meaning. It simply stops supporting it. This forces a redefinition of resilience. Resilience is no longer about building structures that last. It is about building structures that can be rebuilt. Systems that accept impermanence not as failure, but as operating condition. Memory becomes modular. Knowledge becomes distributed. Identity becomes flexible. Thickness is replaced by agility. This does not eliminate awareness. It changes its posture. Awareness, in a post-basin universe, would be more present-focused, less invested in permanence, less anchored to long arcs of history, not because it has forgotten the past, but because the past no longer anchors the present reliably. This is where a deep misunderstanding often arises. We tend to equate thin time with emptiness, meaninglessness, or despair. But meaning does not require thickness in the same way memory does. Meaning can exist in immediacy, just as beauty can exist in a moment that leaves no trace. The danger is not that meaning disappears. The danger is that we cling to forms of meaning that require a basin. This is the third defining feature of a post-basin universe. Meaning detaches from permanence. In a basin, meaning accumulates. It is historical, layered, referential. In a post-basin state, meaning becomes situational, relational, present-bound. Neither is superior. But confusing one for the other creates suffering. This reframes a question we often ask. What will be left? It's resaying. In a post-basin universe, this question loses relevance. Not because nothing remains, but because remaining is no longer the metric. What matters is not what endures indefinitely, but what resonates while it exists. This is not resignation. It is alignment. The universe is not obligated to remember us forever. It only ever allowed us to remember ourselves for a time. And that allowance may be changing. Which brings us to the most delicate point so far. If the universe is entering a post-basin phase, then our instinct to preserve knowledge, culture, identity must adapt. Preservation cannot aim for eternity. It must aim for transmission across thinning time. That means compression, distillation, signal over archive, essence over accumulation. This is not decay. It is refinement under constraint. Just as organisms evolve under changing environments, awareness must evolve under changing temporal conditions, not by fighting the slope, but by learning how to move on it. This is where the metaphor of leaning becomes unavoidable again. A post-basin universe does not push you off a cliff. It asks you to adjust your balance. Lean too rigidly toward permanence, and you fracture. Lean too freely into flow, and you lose coherence. The viable posture lies between. This is not a conclusion, it is a threshold. Because if this post-basin state exists or is emerging, then the next question is no longer about survival or collapse. It is about what kinds of awareness are compatible with thin time. What kinds of intelligence thrive without deep memory? What kinds of meaning persist without accumulation? What kinds of continuity exist when history no longer stacks easily? These are not science fiction questions. They are evolutionary ones, and they lead us directly into the next chapter. If the basin is fading, what new forms of existence does the universe begin to favor in its place? When the ground no longer holds memory, survival changes its meaning. In a basin, existence favors what can endure. Systems that accumulate history thrive. Structures that preserve information grow deeper roots. Stability is rewarded because the terrain supports it. But when time thins, when the universe no longer offers patience as a background condition, the advantage shifts. The universe begins to favor what can move, not quickly in space, but lightly in time. This is the quiet selection pressure of a post-basin world. Forms of existence that depend on long accumulation struggle, forms that can reconstitute themselves repeatedly with minimal reliance on stored past, begin to flourish, not because they are better, but because they are compatible with the slope. This is not extinction, it is replacement. In thin time, rigidity becomes a liability. Heavy structures sink into erosion. What survives is not what remembers the most, but what can function with the least memory. This is the first principle of post-basin existence: continuity through regeneration, not preservation. Instead of building monuments, systems learn to rebuild themselves quickly. Instead of storing vast archives, they compress meaning into minimal signals that can be transmitted, decoded, and reconstructed before time washes them away. Information does not disappear. It changes form. In a basin, information accumulates like sediment layer upon layer, deepening history. In thin time, information behaves more like a pulse brief, intense and self-contained. This distinction matters because we often assume that intelligence requires memory, that awareness depends on storing vast amounts of information. But memory is not binary. It has modes. It can be deep or shallow, long or short, explicit or implicit. In a post-basin universe, intelligence would not vanish. It would adapt. It would become more procedural than historical, more focused on patterns that can be regenerated on demand, rather than narratives that must be preserved across long spans. This is not unfamiliar to us. We already see hints of this shift in how systems behave under acceleration. When environments change rapidly, organisms rely less on stored knowledge and more on flexible rules. They favor heuristics over archives, reflex over deliberation, adaptation over tradition. This is not regression. It is optimization for thin time. In such conditions, awareness becomes less about identity across time and more about responsiveness within time. Less about who you were, more about what you can do now. This alters the structure of selfhood. In a basin, identity is layered. It is built from accumulated memory. Past experiences anchor present choices. Continuity is assumed. In thin time, identity becomes modular, contextual, situational, less anchored to a long personal history, more defined by current state and immediate relations. This does not mean the self dissolves. It means the self lightens, and light things travel better on steep slopes. This is the second principle of post-basin existence. Identity shifts from continuity to coherence. Coherence does not require a long past. It requires alignment in the present. A system can be coherent without being ancient, stable without being deep. This is difficult for basin-adapted minds to accept. We equate depth with meaning, longevity with value, endurance with success. But these values emerged under specific temporal conditions. They are not universal. In thin time, meaning cannot rely on duration. It must rely on resonance, on the ability to matter within the moment it exists. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Much of what we call progress assumes a basin. It assumes that knowledge accumulates. Systems can build indefinitely on what came before, that future generations inherit intact structures. If the basin fades, progress changes shape. It becomes cyclical rather than linear, iterative rather than accumulative, focused on recurring regeneration instead of permanent construction. Again, this is not collapse. It is reconfiguration. The universe does not destroy complexity when time thins. It selects for a different kind of complexity. Complexity that is lighter. Complexity that is faster to assemble. Complexity that does not depend on deep memory. This may sound alien, but it is not unfamiliar. Nature has always balanced two strategies: longevity and reproduction. Some organisms live long and change slowly. Others live briefly but reproduce rapidly. Neither is superior. Each thrives under different conditions. A post-basin universe favors the latter. Existence becomes less about lasting and more about recurring. Patterns matter more than instances. Processes matter more than products. What survives is not the thing, but the method by which the thing can be recreated. This is the third principle. Inheritance shifts from objects to rules. Instead of passing down artifacts, systems pass down algorithms. Instead of preserving forms, they preserve transformations. What matters is not what you have, but what you can regenerate. In thin time, the most resilient information is not stored, it is enacted. This has profound implications for awareness. Consciousness, in such a universe, would not be oriented toward legacy. It would not ask what remains after it is gone. It would ask what happens now and how this moment aligns with the next. This kind of awareness is not shallow. It is acute. It does not stretch far into the past or future, but it is intensely present. It is sensitive to immediate conditions, quick to adjust, quick to respond. Such awareness may feel unfamiliar to us because we evolved in a basin. We are attuned to long arcs, deep memory, cumulative meaning. But awareness is not fixed. It is shaped by environment. If the environment changes, awareness changes with it. This reframes a fear that often accompanies discussions of acceleration and impermanence, the fear that meaning is being lost. Meaning is not being lost. It is being recontextualized. Meaning that depended on permanent struggles. Meaning that can exist in immediacy persists. This is not a moral judgment. It is an ecological one. Just as life on land differs from life in water, awareness in thin time differs from awareness in thick time. Neither is more real. Each is adapted to its terrain, which leads us to a subtle but crucial point. A post-basin universe does not eliminate basins entirely. It fragments them. Local pockets of thickness still exist, temporary, fragile, mobile, meaningful not because they last forever, but because they form where conditions briefly allow depth. These pockets appear, disappear, reappear elsewhere. They are oases, not continents. Existence becomes nomadic, not spatially, but temporally. Systems move between pockets of thickness, making use of depth where it exists, adapting to thinness where it does not. Memory becomes opportunistic. Continuity becomes local rather than global. This is not chaos. It is a different order, an order defined not by permanence, but by timing. This perspective softens a common anxiety, the fear that everything is dissolving into noise. Noise only exists when you expect accumulation. When you release that expectation, patterns emerge again shorter, sharper, more transient. The universe does not stop forming patterns. It just stops letting them pile up. This suggests a final, quietly transformative insight. If the basin is fading, the question is not how to restore it. Slopes cannot be commanded. The question is how to live well on a slope that no longer waits. The answer is not to cling harder to memory, but to learn when to let go. Not to abandon meaning, but to allow meaning to arise without demanding permanence. This is not resignation. It is maturity under constraint, and it brings us naturally to the next threshold. If the universe favors lighter forms of existence in thin time, then what happens to deep awareness, reflection, philosophy, wonder, things that seem to require patience? Do they disappear? Do they transform into something we have not yet learned to recognize? That question carries us into the next chapter. Deep awareness does not vanish when time thins. It changes its posture. We often assume that reflection requires slowness, that philosophy demands long pauses, that wonder needs patience to unfold. This assumption is natural from minds shaped inside a basin where time lingered, where thought could stretch itself across long arcs without being swept away. But deep awareness is not the same as long awareness. Depth does not always come from duration. Sometimes it comes from precision. In a post-basin universe where time no longer waits, where memory must be rebuilt, rather than preserved, awareness cannot rely on extended continuity. It cannot assume that thoughts will remain available simply because they once existed. Reflection becomes costly. Attention becomes fragile. And yet, this pressure does not eliminate depth. It sharpens it. This is the first transformation of deep awareness in thin time, from accumulation to compression. Instead of unfolding slowly across long sequences, insight condenses. Meaning collapses into brief moments of clarity that carry disproportionate weight. Understanding no longer grows by layering, but by crystallization. Think of how lightning illuminates a landscape. It does not last long. It does not allow leisurely inspection. But in a single flash, it reveals structure that daylight might obscure. Deep awareness in thin time behaves like that. Not extended contemplation, but sudden alignment. Not long narratives, but short, resonant configurations that momentarily hold everything in place. This is not shallowness. It is intensity. In a basin, depth is measured by how much can be held over time. In thin time, depth is measured by how much can be aligned at once. This distinction matters because it changes how meaning survives. When time thickens, meaning accumulates historically. It builds traditions, philosophies, bodies of knowledge that grow heavier with each generation. Reflection is a slow craft. When time thins, meaning must travel light. It survives not as archives, but as forms that can be reactivated quickly. Symbols, metaphors, gestures, questions, compact carriers of insight that can be unpacked rapidly before the flow sweeps on. This may explain why certain ideas persist across eras of instability, while others vanish. It is not always the most comprehensive ideas that survive. It is the most compressible ones. Parables outlast treatises. Questions outlast answers. Images outlast explanations. Deep awareness, in this sense, evolves toward minimalism, not because it prefers simplicity, but because complexity must fit through a narrower temporal window. This brings us to the second transformation, from permanence to recurrence. In a basin, awareness seeks to establish lasting frameworks. Worldviews aim for completeness. Philosophies aspire to coherence across lifetimes. Meaning is something you build and then inhabit. In thin time, awareness cannot settle into such structures. Frameworks erode. Systems require constant reassembly. Meaning cannot be a place you live, it must be something you revisit. Deep awareness becomes cyclical, not repeating the same thoughts endlessly, but returning to essential questions again and again, each time from a slightly different angle. Reflection becomes rhythmic rather than linear. Understanding pulses instead of accumulates. This is why wonder survives, even when patience fades. Wonder does not require long memory. It requires openness, the ability to encounter the world as if it could still surprise you, even if you have seen it before. In thin time, surprise becomes easier, not because the world changes more, but because attention cannot afford to become complacent. When continuity is fragile, awareness remains alert. It does not assume that meaning will still be there later. It meets it now. This shifts the emotional tone of reflection. In a basin, philosophy often feels heavy, serious, weighty, burdened by the responsibility of permanence. In thin time, philosophy becomes lighter, even playful, not because it cares less, but because it cannot afford rigidity. Rigidity shatters on slopes. This is the third transformation, from certainty to orientation. Deep awareness in a basin seeks answers, builds systems that aim to be right, complete, final. Certainty feels achievable because time allows correction, refinement, and defense. In thin time, certainty becomes dangerous. Fixed positions require maintenance that the environment no longer supports. Awareness shifts from holding answers to maintaining orientation, knowing how to move, where to lean, when to adjust. Orientation is not ignorance. It is adaptability with depth. An oriented mind does not ask, what is true forever? It asks, what aligns now, without closing off what may come next. It trades absolutes for bearings. This is not relativism. It is navigation. A sailor does not need the ocean to be stable. They need to understand currents, winds, and their own position within them. Likewise, deep awareness in thin time becomes navigational rather than architectural. It builds compasses, not monuments. This may feel like a loss to Bayesian-adapted minds. We mourn the fading of grand systems, long traditions, deep historical continuity. We fear that without them, awareness becomes shallow or fragmented. But this fear confuses form with function. The function of deep awareness is not to last. It is to align experience with understanding. That function can be fulfilled in many forms. In thin time, alignment must happen quickly, repeatedly, and without guarantee of persistence. Awareness learns to enter, resonate, and release rather than accumulate and defend. This does not make it weaker. It makes it lighter, and light things, again, travel better on slopes. There is another subtle change that follows. In a basin, deep awareness often separates itself from action. Reflection happens first. Behavior follows. There is time to think, then to do. Philosophy precedes practice. In thin time, this separation collapses. Reflection and action converge. Awareness must express itself immediately, because delay risks irrelevance. Understanding that cannot be enacted quickly loses its chance to matter. This does not eliminate contemplation. It embeds it. Thought becomes embodied. Insight becomes behavior. Meaning manifests not as explanation, but as response. This is why deep awareness in thin time often looks quiet from the outside. It does not announce itself with elaborate theories. It reveals itself through choices, timing, restraint. It is less concerned with saying what the universe is, and more concerned with moving correctly within it. This brings us to a paradox. As time thins, awareness becomes both more fragile and more essential. Fragile because it cannot rely on long continuity. Essential because without it, systems lose orientation entirely. In a basin, you can survive some confusion. The environment forgives misalignment. Time gives you room to correct. In thin time, misalignment compounds quickly. Without awareness, systems overshoot, oscillate, collapse into noise. Awareness becomes the stabilizing factor not by slowing time, but by synchronizing with it. This may be why periods of acceleration often feel intellectually and spiritually demanding, not because answers are missing, but because orientation is harder to maintain. Awareness must work continuously to keep systems coherent, which leads to a final, quiet insight in this chapter. Deep awareness does not disappear when the basin fades. It migrates from the background to the foreground. In a basin, awareness is supported. In thin time, awareness becomes support. It no longer rests on the universe's patience. The universe rests, briefly, on it. This does not grant awareness control. It grants it responsibility, not moral responsibility, but functional responsibility. The responsibility of alignment in a world that no longer waits. This reframes the role of wonder. Wonder is not escapism. It is calibration. The ability to remain open, attentive, and responsive in the face of impermanence is not weakness. It is the highest form of adaptation in thin time. Which brings us naturally to the next chapter. If deep awareness survives by compressing, orienting, and embodying itself, then what happens to sleep, the state where awareness loosens its grip? where time is felt most strangely, where the universe seems to speak without words. Does sleep still serve a function when time no longer lingers? Or does it become something else entirely? Sleep was never just rest. It only looked that way in a basin. When time lingered, when continuity was generous, sleep appeared to be a pause, a lowering of activity, a retreat from awareness, a temporary withdrawal from the flow of events. We learned to describe it as recovery, repair, silence. But that description assumes something quietly powerful, that time would still be there when we woke up. In a universe where time thins, sleep reveals its deeper role. It is not a pause. It is a recalibration. When time no longer waits, awareness cannot afford to stay rigid. It cannot cling to orientation continuously without exhaustion. It must periodically release its grip, not to disappear, but to realign with the slope it is standing on. Sleep is how that realignment happens. This is the first shift in understanding sleep under thin time. Sleep is not absence of awareness, but redistribution of it. When we sleep, awareness does not vanish. It diffuses. It loosens its attachment to immediate sequence, to linear causality, to the insistence on now, then, next. In doing so, it allows itself to feel the deeper currents of time, the ones too subtle to detect while fully awake. This is why time behaves strangely in sleep. Moments stretch, hours vanish, events collapse into symbols. Sleep is the state in which awareness temporarily stops resisting the slope. During waking life, awareness acts like friction. It stabilizes identity, preserves memory, maintains orientation. It resists drift. This resistance is necessary, but it is costly. In thin time, constant resistance leads to fatigue, misalignment, and loss of coherence. Sleep releases that resistance, not to surrender, but to reset. Imagine walking on a long incline. If you never stop bracing yourself, your muscles tighten, your balance stiffens, your movements become inefficient. A brief rest allows gravity to remind you how the ground actually behaves. Sleep lets gravity speak. This reframes dreams. Dreams are often treated as noise, random firings, meaningless imagery. But in the context of a tilted universe, dreams look different. They are not stories meant to be remembered. They are orientation exercises. In dreams, time abandons linearity. Causes and effects dissolve. Identities blur. Scenes merge. This is not dysfunction. It is training. Dreams teach awareness how to operate without relying on accumulated continuity. They rehearse responsiveness without permanence. They allow meaning to arise without demanding duration. In a post-basin environment, this skill is essential. Dream logic is thin time logic. It does not require things to last. It requires them to resonate briefly, then release. Images appear, do their work, and fade. No archive is built. No explanation is needed. This is not confusion. It is alignment with a faster slope. This is the second transformation. Sleep becomes a survival mechanism for awareness in thin time. Not because the body needs rest, though it does, but because awareness needs to periodically shed its dependence on thick time. Sleep teaches the mind how to function when accumulation is unreliable. This may explain why sleep deprivation feels existentially destabilizing. Not merely tiring, but disorienting. When sleep is lost, awareness remains locked in resistance mode. It keeps bracing against the slope, refusing to release, until coherence fractures. Insomnia is not just lack of sleep. It is failure to let go of thickness. And in a universe where time no longer guarantees patience, that failure becomes increasingly costly. This also reframes the role of unconsciousness. We often think of unconsciousness as absence, nothing happening, awareness turned off. But unconsciousness is not emptiness. It is a different mode of processing, one that does not privilege linear memory or explicit identity. In thin time, this mode is not optional. It is adaptive. Sleep allows awareness to reorganize itself without the burden of preserving narrative continuity. It breaks habits of thought that only make sense in a basin. It dissolves rigid identity structures that become liabilities on slopes. This is why awakening often feels subtly different after deep sleep. Not just refreshed, reoriented. You wake up not with more time, but with better balance. Sleep does not give you back hours. It gives you back alignment. So explains why sleep becomes more important, not less, under acceleration. As time thins, the waking state becomes increasingly demanding. Information density rises. Decisions compress. Feedback loops shorten. Awareness must operate continuously at higher intensity. Without sleep, orientation collapses. This suggests something quietly radical. Sleep is not a relic of a slower universe. It is preparation for a faster one. As time thins, sleep becomes the place where awareness rehearses survival under conditions of impermanence. It practices letting go without dissolving. It learns to reassemble coherence quickly. Dreams, then, are not escapism. They are calibration drills. This may be why dreams feel symbolic rather than literal. Symbols compress meaning. They carry more information per unit of time than narratives. In thin time, compression is not stylistic, it is necessary. A dream image can do in seconds what a waking explanation would take hours to unfold. This is not inefficiency, it is optimization. Sleep, therefore, becomes the bridge between basin-aware minds and post-basin reality. It is where awareness learns to exist without insisting on continuity, without panicking at impermanence, without demanding that meaning last. This reframes the fear that sleep is lost time. In thin time, sleep is the only place where awareness is allowed to fall behind so it can catch up correctly. And this leads to an unsettling but comforting insight. If sleep is how awareness adapts to thinning time, then the increasing importance of sleep is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of intelligence. Intelligence recognizing that the terrain has changed. But there is another layer. Sleep does not just recalibrate individuals. It synchronizes populations. Sleep cycles align organisms with larger temporal rhythms, planetary rotation, seasonal changes, biological oscillations. These rhythms persist even as other continuities fade. Sleep anchors awareness to recurring time, not accumulated time. This is crucial. In a post-basin universe, recurrence replaces accumulation. Cycles matter more than histories. Rhythms matter more than archives. Sleep attunes awareness to rhythm. It teaches the mind how to live without relying on permanence by grounding it in return. Night returns. Sleep returns. Awakening returns. Even when nothing else lasts. This may be why sleep feels so ancient, older than culture, older than memory. It is not a human invention. It is a strategy older than awareness itself. A strategy for living on slopes. Which brings us to the next question, one that can no longer be postponed. If sleep is how awareness adapts to thinning time, what happens when even sleep begins to change? When dreams shorten, when cycles compress, when rest itself becomes fragile? What does the universe ask of awareness then? That question carries us into the next chapter. When sleep begins to change, the universe is not taking something away. It is asking for a different kind of listening. Sleep, as we have known it, belongs to a world where cycles were long enough to be trusted. Night followed day with patience. Dreams unfolded with room to wander. Rest felt deep, immersive, restorative, not because nothing happened, but because time allowed recovery to complete itself. But in thin time, Even sleep is reshaped, not abolished, not denied, compressed. People notice this first as restlessness, shorter nights, lighter sleep, dreams that flicker rather than unfold, awakening that arrives before the sense of completion. We usually frame this as disturbance, as stress, distraction, modernity pressing too hard against ancient rhythms. Those explanations are not wrong, but they may not be sufficient. If time itself is thinning, then sleep cannot remain what it was. A recalibration process must adapt to the conditions it is recalibrating for. When the slope steepens, even rest must learn how to move. This is the first shift. Sleep becomes intermittent rather than immersive. Instead of one long descent into depth, rest fragments into smaller adjustments, short cycles, micro-pauses, moments of release threaded through waking life rather than confined to a single block. This is not degeneration, it is redistribution. In a post-basin environment, awareness cannot afford to disengage for too long. The flow moves too quickly. The entry becomes costly. Instead, awareness learns to dip briefly, loosening its grip, reorienting, and returning. Sleep becomes more like blinking than closing one's eyes for hours. This reframes fatigue. Fatigue is not always lack of rest. Often, it is misalignment between the form of rest we attempt and the form of time we inhabit. Trying to rest as if the basin were still deep leads to frustration. The body releases, but the world does not wait. Thin time interrupts, which means rest must learn to fit into thinner gaps. This leads to the second shift. Dreams become denser. When there is less time for wandering, dreams compress their work. They rely more heavily on symbolism, emotion, and sudden transformation. Long narratives dissolve. Scenes collapse into one another. Meaning arrives without explanation and leaves without conclusion. This is not loss of meaning, it is concentration of it. A dream that once took an hour to unfold now delivers its orientation in seconds. The imagery is sharper, the transitions faster, the emotional impact more immediate. Dreams stop teaching through story. They teach through alignment. This is why such dreams often feel strange upon waking, not confusing, but difficult to translate. They were not meant to be explained. They were meant to adjust internal posture, to tune awareness to the slope. This also explains why people often report that their most meaningful dreams are the hardest to describe. Language is a basin tool. Dreams in thin time operate without it. The third shift is more subtle. Sleep begins to leak into waking life. In a basin, the boundary between waking and sleeping was clear. You were either engaged with the world or withdrawn from it. Awareness toggled cleanly between modes. In thin time, this boundary softens. Moments of dreamlike perception appear during the day. Time feels unreal. Identity loosens briefly. Meaning surfaces unexpectedly and vanishes just as quickly. Attention drifts, not into distraction, but into a lighter state of presence. This is often pathologized, but it may be adaptive. Awareness learns to carry some of sleep's flexibility into waking life, because rigid wakefulness becomes exhausting on a steep slope. The mind needs to partially release even while active. This is not dissociation, it is partial recalibration. Sleep, in this sense, is no longer confined to night. It becomes a distributed function, small resets woven into activity. Awareness learns to breathe. This changes how consciousness experiences time. Instead of long arcs of effort punctuated by rest, life becomes a rhythm of micro-engagements and micro-releases. Attention pulses, presence intensifies, then softens, then returns. This is not inefficiency, it is pacing. In thin time, pacing replaces endurance. This brings us to a difficult realization. Many of the practices we associate with rest, prolonged withdrawal, total disengagement, deep isolation may become less effective as time thins, not because they are harmful, but because they no longer match the terrain. The universe does not punish us for resting incorrectly. It simply fails to respond. Rest that does not recalibrate orientation becomes sleep without recovery. Awakening arrives, but alignment does not. This is why rest increasingly feels like something that must be learned again. The old maps no longer fit. This does not mean the universe is hostile to rest. It means rest must become responsive, shorter, more frequent, more attuned, less about escape, more about tuning. This reframes something essential. Sleep is not the opposite of wakefulness. It is its partner. And as wakefulness becomes more demanding, more compressed, more accelerated, sleep must evolve to keep up. This does not reduce its mystery. It deepens it. Because sleep is not simply reacting to thinning time. It is listening to it. Dreams, micro-rests, altered rhythms. All of these are awareness, attempting to stay in conversation with a universe that no longer pauses. Sleep becomes the place where awareness hears what waking life cannot. Not messages, not instructions, but gradients. The subtle shifts in how time is leaning today compared to yesterday. The change is too small to notice consciously, but too important to ignore. This is why people often wake with a sense of knowing without knowing what they know. Feeling of adjustment, of something having been handled beneath language. Sleep handled it, which leads to the most important shift of all. When sleep changes, it is no longer only personal. It becomes collective. As rhythms compress, shared cycles matter more. Populations synchronize through patterns of rest and wakefulness, not because of culture alone, but because synchronization stabilizes systems when continuity is fragile. Shared pauses create temporary basins, moments when time thickens just enough for coordination, meaning, and memory to align. This suggests that, in thin time, solitude cannot carry all the burden of rest. Rest becomes relational, not because individuals are insufficient, but because alignment requires resonance. One system adjusting alone is fragile. Many adjusting together create a pocket of thickness. This is why collective rituals, shared silence, shared rhythm, shared slowing become powerful under acceleration. They are not nostalgic, they are geomorphic. They alter how time behaves locally. Sleep, in its evolved form, is no longer only about closing eyes. It is about opening alignment. Which brings us to the next question, a question that can no longer be answered by physiology alone. If sleep is becoming lighter, denser, distributed, and collective, what happens to death, the deepest release of all, in a universe where time no longer lingers? Does death remain an ending? Or does it, too, change its meaning on a slope that never truly stops moving? That question carries us into the next chapter. Death was never only an ending. It only felt that way in a basin. When time lingered, when continuity was generous and history accumulated naturally, death appeared as a rupture, a break in sequence, a point where memory stopped stacking, where a narrative could no longer extend itself forward. Against the background of thick time, death looked final because everything else was slow enough to persist. But in thin time, the meaning of death begins to shift. Not because it becomes less real, not because it is softened or undone, but because the environment that once framed it has changed. To understand this, we must let go of the idea that death has a single, universal role. Like sleep, like awareness, like meaning itself, death is shaped by temporal conditions. What it does depends on how time behaves around it. In a basin, death is a cliff. On a slope, death is a release. This distinction is subtle but profound. In a post-basin universe where time no longer lingers reliably, where persistence must be actively maintained, death stops being the primary event that ends continuity. Continuity is already fragile. Memory already thins. Narratives already struggle to stack. Death does not arrive to break what was stable. It arrives into a system already in motion. This is the first transformation. Death loses its monopoly on finality. In thin time, many things end before death arrives. Projects dissolve. Identities shift. Meanings fade and reform. Continuity fractures and reconstitutes repeatedly. By the time death occurs, impermanence is no longer shocking. Death becomes one release among many, not trivial, not painless, but no longer singular. This does not make death smaller. It makes it more precise. In a basin, death carried too much weight. It was asked to do everything at once. End identity, end memory, end presence, end meaning. It stood in contrast to a world that otherwise promised duration. In thin time, that contrast fades. Death is no longer responsible for ending what time itself no longer guarantees. This changes how death is felt. Instead of terror at absolute erasure, death begins to resemble a final letting go of resistance, the last release of effort. The moment when a system that has been continually reassembling itself stops doing so. Not collapse, completion. This does not mean that loss disappears. Loss is still real, perhaps even more so because attachments must be lighter, more frequent, more provisional. Bonds form knowing they may not persist. Meaning arises knowing it may not accumulate. But death no longer stands alone as the great destroyer. Time has already taught impermanence. This is the second transformation. Death becomes aligned with the slope rather than opposed to it. In a basin, life pushes against time. It accumulates, resists, builds. It arrives as a force that undoes that resistance. It feels antagonistic. On a slope, life is already learning to flow, to rebuild rather than preserve, to resonate rather than endure. Death, then, is not the enemy of life's strategy. It is its final expression. This reframes the relationship between life and death. They are no longer opposites. They are phases of the same movement. Life, in thin time, is the art of forming coherence temporarily. Death is the moment when the art is no longer practiced. Not because it failed, but because the practice is complete. This perspective removes the moral weight we often place on death. Death is not punishment. It is not negation. It is not the universe withdrawing something it once promised. The universe never promised permanence. It allowed presence, which leads to a difficult but liberating realization. Fear of death is largely fear of losing continuity. In a basin, this fear makes sense. Continuity felt natural, expected, almost guaranteed. Death violated an assumption. In thin time, continuity is already provisional. Awareness learns to release and reform repeatedly. Identity becomes lighter. Meaning becomes situational. Fear does not vanish, but it changes shape. It becomes less about annihilation and more about misalignment, about leaving before release is complete, about tension unresolved, about resistance held too long. This is why death in thin time often feels like exhaustion rather than terror. Not always consciously, not in every case, but as a pattern, it feels like the end of effort, which brings us to a deeper layer. If death is a release of resistance, then it is not merely an event that happens to an individual. It is part of the same continuum that includes sleep, rest, letting go, and dissolution. Sleep releases awareness temporarily. Death releases it completely. But the mechanism is similar. Both involve surrendering linear sequence. Both dissolve identity boundaries. Both remove the insistence on accumulation. The difference is not qualitative. It is total. This is the third transformation. Death becomes the final recalibration. In a basin, recalibration happened repeatedly through sleep, through rest, through reflection, because the system expected to continue. Death interrupted that expectation. In thin time, recalibration is constant. Death is simply the last adjustment, when no further alignment is required. This reframes the idea of an afterlife not as a continuation of personal narrative, but as a continuation of flow, not survival of identity, but reintegration with slope. This does not require belief in anything supernatural. It requires only consistency. If awareness is a phenomenon that arises where time lingers, then when time no longer supports that phenomenon, awareness does not go anywhere. It dissolves, not into nothingness, into immediacy. The same immediacy that exists beyond temporal edges, the same state where events happen without accumulation, where presence exists without memory. Death, then, is not entering darkness. It is entering non-retention. This may sound cold, but it carries a quiet mercy. In non-retention, there is no loss. Loss requires memory. Suffering requires persistence of misalignment. Where nothing is retained, nothing is carried forward to hurt. This does not trivialize dying. It contextualizes it. Dying is difficult because we are Bayesian-adapted beings, learning to release in a world that increasingly requires release. We cling because continuity once worked. We resist because resistance once mattered. Death asks for what the universe has been gently teaching all along: let go. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. If death is no longer the singular boundary it once was, what happens to mourning, to grief, to the ways we honor what no longer persists? Grief, like everything else, is shaped by time. In a basin, grief stretches. It accumulates. It becomes part of identity. It lingers because time lingers. In thin time, grief changes, not because it weakens, but because it cannot settle. Grief becomes sharper, more immediate, less able to fossilize. It comes in waves rather than layers. It demands presence rather than endurance. This does not make grief less meaningful. It makes it more alive. Becomes an act of momentary honoring rather than long-term possession. Memory is revisited rather than stored. Love expresses itself in return rather than preservation. This may feel like loss of dignity to Bayesian-shaped minds, but it is another form of care. Care adapted to a slope, which brings us to the most subtle shift of all. In thin time, death begins to teach the living how to live. Not by threatening them, but by modeling release. Life becomes less about building something that outlasts you, and more about aligning with what exists while you are here. Meaning shifts from legacy to resonance. Not what remains after you, but what changes because you were present. This is not nihilism. It is intimacy with impermanence. And it prepares us for the final phase of our journey. Because once death is understood not as an ending but as alignment with non-retention, a final question emerges, one that brings the entire arc of this story toward its quiet resolution. If the universe allows awareness only where time lingers and releases it where time thins, then what is the universe actually doing as it leans, flows, remembers, and forgets? Is it moving toward something? Or is it simply learning slowly, unevenly, how to let go? That question carries us into the final chapters. If the universe is letting go, it is not doing so out of exhaustion. It is doing so out of coherence. We often imagine letting go as failure, something that happens when strength runs out, when systems can no longer hold themselves together. But what we have traced so far suggests a different picture. Letting go is not the opposite of order. It is a different expression of it. In a basin, order accumulates. On a slope, order flows. The universe does not abandon structure when time thins. It abandons retention. And retention, for all its usefulness, is not the same thing as meaning. This is the quiet pivot we arrive at now. Meaning does not require memory to last forever. Meaning requires alignment while it exists. When time lingers, alignment can be maintained across long spans. When time thins, alignment must happen repeatedly, briefly, and without guarantee. In both cases, meaning is real not because it endures, but because it fits. This reframes what it means for the universe to do anything at all. We often ask whether the universe is heading towards something: a heat death, a collapse, a rebirth. These questions assume a destination, an endpoint where the story resolves. But a universe defined by slopes and flows may not be a story in that sense. It may be a practice, a continual adjustment between accumulation and release, between remembering and forgetting, between forming and dissolving, not progress, not decay, calibration. This is the first insight of this chapter. The universe is not becoming less ordered, it is becoming differently ordered. In thick time, order expresses itself as persistence. Structures remain, histories stack, identity stabilizes. The universe feels heavy with memory. In thin time, order expresses itself as responsiveness. Structures appear when conditions allow and dissolve when they do not. Identity becomes situational. The universe feels light. Neither mode is superior. Each answers a different constraint. A universe that only remembers would stagnate. A universe that only forgets would never form. The lean we have been following is not a slide toward emptiness. It is a shift in balance between these modes. This helps resolve a tension that has been present throughout our exploration. If time is thinning, why does the universe still feel full? Why do patterns still emerge? Why does meaning still arise? Because fullness does not come from accumulation alone. It comes from fit. A melody does not need to last forever to be complete. A wave does not need to stay to be real. In thin time, reality becomes more wave-like. Events rise, crest, and fall without insisting on sediment. Presence replaces permanence as the measure of existence. This brings us to a subtle but essential distinction. For beings shaped in basins, forgetting feels like loss. We equate memory with value. To forget is to diminish. To dissolve is to betray what mattered. But forgetting at the cosmic scale is not betrayal, it is circulation. What is not retained is not erased. It is redistributed. Energy spreads. Patterns dissolve into conditions that make new patterns possible elsewhere. The universe does not destroy its past. It diffuses it. This is the second insight. Forgetting is how the universe makes room. In a basin, room is created by expansion space opening up. In thin time, room is created by release history loosening its grip. Both achieve the same result: availability. Availability for what? Not for a predetermined outcome, for possibility. A universe that remembers too much becomes rigid. Its past overdetermines its future. Every new configuration is constrained by accumulated history. A universe that forgets selectively remains flexible. It can reconfigure without being trapped by what once was. Seen this way, the lean of the universe is not toward death. It is toward freedom of reconfiguration. This does not comfort us easily because we are attached to our memories. We are made of them, but attachment is not the same as necessity. The universe does not need to remember us for us to have mattered. This idea feels dangerous because it challenges a deeply human hope that meaning requires permanence. That to matter is to leave a mark that endures. But endurance is not the only way to matter. Alignment is another. When a system aligns with its conditions, when it fits the slope it inhabits, it contributes to coherence, even if it does not persist. Its role is not to remain, but to resolve something locally. A snowflake resolves a pattern in the air. A wave resolves energy in the ocean. A thought resolves a tension in awareness. None of these need to last to be real. This reframes our place in the universe one last time. We are not inscriptions on a cosmic monument. We are adjustments in a moving field, temporary, precise, necessary while we happen. This is the third insight. Existence is not about being kept, it is about being used. Used not by intention, but by fit, by matching conditions, by resolving gradients. When time lingers, resolution can be slow and layered. When time thins, resolution must be quick and clean. Both are valid. Both are part of the same movement. This helps us understand why the universe appears to both care and not care at the same time. It supports complexity where conditions allow and releases it where they do not. It does not mourn. It does not celebrate. It flows. Which brings us to a quiet but decisive shift in perspective. We no longer need to ask whether the universe is meaningful. Meaning is not something the universe contains. Meaning is something that appears where time, awareness, and alignment intersect. When that intersection dissolves, meaning does not vanish from the universe. It vanishes from that location. Elsewhere, under different conditions, it appears again. This is not cruelty. It is continuity of a different kind. Continuity not of objects, but of process. The universe does not carry forward specific meanings. It carries forward the conditions that allow meaning to arise. This resolves a paradox we have been circling since the beginning. If the universe has no center, no intention, no memory that lasts forever, how can anything matter? Because mattering is local, and locality is enough. A basin is local, a slope is local, awareness is local, and within that locality, alignment creates significance. The universe does not need to remember us. We remember ourselves. And while we do, meaning exists. When we no longer can, meaning does not grieve. It migrates. This may be the most difficult lesson for basin-shaped minds to accept, but it is also the most liberating. Nothing is wasted. What does not persist does not fail. It completes, which brings us to the threshold of the final movement. If the universe is learning how to let go, not as collapse, but as coherence, then the final chapters are not about endings. They are about return. Return not to a beginning, but to a state where the lean, the flow, the remembering, and the forgetting are seen as one continuous gesture. The next chapter will step into that return, not to resolve the mystery, not to answer it, but to rest inside it. Because if there is one thing a tilted universe teaches gently, over and over again, it is this: you do not have to hold on forever, to have been exactly where you were needed. Return does not mean going back. It means arriving differently. Most of this journey, we have followed the universe as it leaned away from perfect balance, away from thick memory, away from the promise that anything could last simply because it once began. We traced how time pooled, how it thinned, how awareness adapted, how sleep recalibrated, how death released, how meaning survived without permanence. Now, the motion changes, not because the universe stops leaning, but because our relationship to the lean shifts. Return is the moment when resistance relaxes, not into collapse, but into understanding. When the slope is no longer something to fight, explain away, or fear. When it becomes something to move with. This is the return, not to symmetry, not to stillness, to coherence. In earlier chapters, the basin gave us a sense of home, a place where time lingered long enough to build stories, identities, civilizations, and long arcs of meaning. The post-basin world asked us to release those expectations and learn lighter ways of existing. Return is where both truths coexist. It is where we stop asking which mode is correct, because neither was ever meant to last alone. The universe does not choose between remembering and forgetting. It alternates. Return, then, is not a destination in space or time. It is a posture of awareness that can hold both accumulation and release without clinging to either. This is the first realization of return. The lean was never a fall. We often speak of imbalance as loss, as something that must be corrected. But nothing in the universe suggests a desire to restore perfect symmetry. Perfect balance is sterile. It does nothing. It leads nowhere. The lean was not an accident. It was permission. Permission for time to move. Permission for structure to form. Permission for awareness to appear. And later, permission for all of it to dissolve when holding became heavier than releasing. Seen this way, the universe has not betrayed anything it created. It has honored it. Every basin was allowed to deepen fully before thinning. Every structure was allowed to exist while conditions supported it. Nothing was cut short. Nothing was stolen. Return is the recognition of this fairness, not fairness as equality, but fairness as fit. What existed did so because the universe made room for it. When it no longer does, it makes room for something else. This reframes our sense of loss. Loss is not evidence that something went wrong. Loss is evidence that something finished. This does not remove grief, but it removes accusation. The universe is not taking something away. It is completing a phase. Return is the moment we stop interpreting completion as failure. This changes how awareness rests. Earlier, sleep became a recalibration. Death became a release. Meaning became alignment without permanence. Now, awareness itself learns a final adjustment. It learns to trust the slope. Trust does not mean surrendering agency. It means understanding the constraints deeply enough to stop wasting energy, resisting what cannot be held. Return is awareness, no longer asking the universe to slow down. It asks itself how to move more gently. This is the second realization. Return is synchronization, not control. In a basin, synchronization was easy. Time moved slowly enough for systems to align naturally. In thin time, synchronization requires attentiveness. Awareness must listen continuously, adjust constantly, release frequently. Return is when this listening becomes effortless, not because the universe changed, because awareness did. This is why return feels quiet. There is no revelation, no final answer, no triumphant clarity, just a sense that the struggle to explain everything has softened, not because everything is explained, but because explanation is no longer the primary need. Orientation is. Return is awareness standing on the slope without bracing, feeling the direction of flow without being pulled apart by it. This also resolves a tension we have carried silently. Throughout this journey, we spoke of the universe leaning, time thinning, basins fading. All of this could sound like a story of decline, a gradual loss of depth, patience, and meaning. Return reframes it. The universe is not becoming less meaningful. It is becoming less attached to meaning. There is a difference. Attachment insists on continuity even when conditions change. Insists only on alignment while it exists. Return is where awareness releases attachment and discovers that meaning still appears. Briefly, precisely, enough. This is the third realization. Return reveals that meaning never depended on duration. We believed meaning needed time to stack because that was how we first encountered it. But meaning has always been an event, not a monument. A moment of coherence between awareness and condition. Those moments can occur in thick time or thin time. They do not vanish when the basin fades. They simply arrive more lightly. This is why return does not feel like despair. It feels like relief. Relief from the obligation to make things last forever. Relief from the burden of legacy. Relief from the fear that if nothing remains, nothing mattered. Return dissolves that fear. Nothing remains. And still everything mattered while it happened. This is not a contradiction. It is the logic of flow. Water does not keep the shape of every wave it ever formed. Yet the river is not empty. The movement continues. Patterns repeat in different forms. The universe does not keep every structure. It keeps the capacity to form structure. Return is awareness aligning with that capacity rather than with any particular form. This also clarifies something about us. We often ask whether humanity, intelligence, or consciousness has a future in a universe like this, whether thinning time threatens everything we value. Return suggests a different framing. The future is not a place where what we are becomes permanent. It is a place where what we are becomes transferable, not as archives, as tendencies, curiosity, attunement, the ability to feel slopes and adjust. These are not tied to basins. They travel. Return is when awareness stops trying to anchor itself to a single configuration and begins to recognize itself as a pattern that can reappear wherever conditions allow. This does not promise survival. It promises recurrence, which is all the universe ever promised. At this stage, even the idea of a story begins to loosen. Stories require memory. They require sequence. They require accumulation. They belong to basins. Return is closer to music. Themes appear. They resolve. They fade. They reappear, transformed. No note lasts. The music remains. This is why return feels familiar even though we have never been here before. Because we recognize the pattern. We have felt it in moments of clarity that did not need explanation, in experiences that felt complete without lasting, in understandings that arrived whole and left without residue. Those moments were not failures of memory. They were glimpses of return. Return is not the end of inquiry. It is the end of urgency. The urgency to fix the universe, the urgency to make meaning permanent, the urgency to force balance where flow is required. In return, awareness accepts that the universe leans because leaning is how anything ever happens. And that is enough. This does not make the universe gentle. It makes it honest. Which brings us to the final threshold. If return is alignment without attachment, if meaning arises without needing to last, if awareness adapts without demanding permanence, then the final question is no longer about the universe. It is about the moment you are in now. Not what it becomes, not what it leaves behind, but whether you can rest inside it, fully, briefly, and without asking it to stay. That question is where the last chapter begins. Close your eyes for a moment, not to escape what has been said, but to let it settle where settling is still possible. This is not an ending in the way stories usually end. Nothing is resolved. Nothing is fixed in place. The universe has not stopped leaning. Time has not slowed for us. Memory has not been promised permanence. And yet something is complete, because the final understanding is not about what the universe will become. It is about how to be inside it. We began with a simple unease, the sense that something about the universe feels slightly off, subtly tilted, quietly asymmetrical. We followed that feeling through basins of time and slopes of forgetting, through awareness adapting, sleep recalibrating, death releasing, meaning surviving without permanence. Now we arrive at the quiet truth beneath all of it. The universe does not ask to be understood. It asks to be met where it is, not where we wish it would stay. The deepest mistake we make is believing that rest comes from stability. that peace arrives when nothing changes. That understanding requires freezing the world long enough to explain it, but stability was never the source of rest. Alignment was. Rest is not found where time stops. Rest is found where resistance ends. In a tilted universe, exhaustion does not come from movement. It comes from bracing against it, from trying to hold what cannot be held, from demanding that moments behave like monuments. The final lesson is gentle, almost disappointingly simple. You do not need the universe to slow down. You need to stop pulling against its direction. This does not mean surrendering to chaos. It means learning the difference between holding and gripping, between caring and clinging, between meaning and permanence. Meaning does not vanish because it ends. It exists because it happens. This is why sleep works, why dreams matter, why moments of clarity arrive without warning. They do not wait for permission. They align briefly and then move on. And that is enough. The universe is not drifting toward emptiness. It is practicing release. Release of forms that have completed their role. Release of memories that have already shaped what comes next. Release of awareness back into immediacy when holding no longer serves. Nothing is erased. Everything is redistributed. Even now, as you listen, time is flowing past you, not as an enemy, not as a thief, but as a current. You are not meant to dam it. You are meant to float. Floating does not mean doing nothing. It means trusting that you do not need to carry the whole river. This is where the story finally becomes quiet. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying more would only add weight where lightness is needed. The universe leans. It always has. That lean is what allowed stars to form, thoughts to arise, sleep to arrive, and awareness to notice itself. And one day, far beyond the scale of concern, everything that remembers will gently forget, not in darkness, in peace. Because forgetting is not loss where nothing is demanded to remain. So rest here, not at the end of understanding, but at the end of effort. Let the slope carry what it must. Let the moment be what it is. You do not need to follow the universe forever. You only need to be here while you are. And now, if you're kind enough, allow yourself to drift. Close your eyes. The universe is still leaning, and you are still exactly where you need to be.